I want to just take a minute and think a little bit with you about where we are and how we got here and what can we do for an encore. Can we have a good 1991 and a 1992? And what will we have to do to continue and assure ourselves that we're taking care of our customers and taking care of our associates and do the right thing? I guess what my reply to that would be that you recognize that Walmart's business is 75% people. 75% at least of our success or failure depends on our people. And we work real hard to have made that point throughout Walmart country, not just with our vendors and suppliers, but those wonderful associates out there in the stores and in those distribution centers and throughout our company that are pleasing our customers, who are mission bound to take care of our customers first because they understand it, and they understand that is the reason for what success we've had.
Bantam Audio Publishing presents a double-day production of Sam Walton, Made in America, by Sam Walton with John Huey, read by Kevin O'Morrison.
Hello, friends. I'm Sam Walton, founder and chairman of Walmart Stores. By now, I hope you've shopped in one of our stores, or maybe bought some stock in our company. If you have, you probably already know how proud I am of what is simply the miracle that all these Walmart associates of mine, almost 400,000 of them now, have accomplished in the 30 years since we opened our first Walmart in Northwest Arkansas, which is still our home. As hard as it is to believe sometimes, we've grown from that one little store into what is now the largest retailing outfit in the world, and we've really had a heck of a time along the way. Looking back on it all, I realize we've been through something amazing here at Walmart, something special that we ought to share more of with all the folks who've been so loyal to our stores and to our company. That's one thing we never did much of while we were building Walmart, talk about ourselves or do a whole lot of bragging. Except when we had to convince some banker or some Wall Street financier that we intended to amount to something someday, that we were worth taking a chance on. Otherwise, we've always kept pretty much to ourselves. We've been very protective of our business dealings and our home lives, and we like it that way. As a result, though, a whole lot of misinformation has gotten around over the years about me and about Walmart. And I think there's been way too much attention paid to my personal finances. Mostly I've just ignored that static and gone about my business. But I've been fighting cancer for a while now, and I'm not getting any younger. And lately, a lot of folks have been fussing at me that I'm really the best person to tell the Walmart story, and that, like it or not, my own life story is all tangled up with the Walmart story, and I should get it down right while I still can. I hope, as I tell it, I can make it as interesting and fun and educational as it's been for all of us. More than anything, though, I want to get across once and for all just how important Walmart's associates have been to our success. Ours is a story about entrepreneurship and risk and hard work and knowing where you want to go and being willing to do what it takes to get there. More than anything, it's a story about how there's absolutely no limit to what ordinary people can accomplish if they're given the opportunity and the encouragement and the incentive to do their best. That's how Walmart became Walmart. Ordinary people joined together to do extraordinary things that at first amazed them. And before too long, it amazed everybody else, especially folks who thought America was just too complicated a place for this sort of thing to work anymore. Ours is a story about the kinds of traditional principles that made America great in the first place. And maybe by telling it the way it happened, we can help some other folks take those principles and apply them to their dreams and make them come true. In some ways, the Walmart story is unique. Nothing quite like it has been done before. But it wasn't the first American success story rooted in sound traditional principles, and you mark my words, it won't be the last. Success has always had its price, I guess, and I learned that lesson the hard way a few years back when Forbes magazine started calling me the richest man in America. Well, it wasn't too hard to imagine all those newspaper and TV folks up in New York saying, "Who? And he lives where?" The next thing we know, they start sending reporters and photographers down here to Bentonville, Arkansas, I guess to take pictures of me diving into some swimming pool full of money they imagined I had, or to watch me light cigars with $100 bills. I wasn't about to cooperate with them, so they found out all these very interesting things about me, like I drove an old pickup truck with cages in the back for my bird dogs. I wore a Walmart ball cap. I got my hair cut in the barber shop just off the town square. Somebody even snuck up and took a picture of me in the barber's chair, and it was in the newspapers all over the country. The next thing you know, folks we'd never heard of started calling and writing us, and even coming here to ask us for money, for a new car, to go on a vacation, whatever came into their minds. Now, I'm a friendly fellow by nature. I always speak to folks in the street and such, and Helen, my wife, is as friendly and outgoing as can be. She's involved in all sorts of community activities. We've always lived very much out in the open. But we really thought there for a while that this riches thing was going to ruin our whole lifestyle. What made me maddest was that the media people weren't even interested in Walmart, the company. All they wanted to talk about was my personal finances. The impression I got was that media folks thought we were a bunch of bumpkins selling socks off the back of a truck, or else that we were fast buck artists or stock scammers. If they did write about the company, they either got it wrong or just made fun of us. Now, I've never talked about any of this stuff before, but I think it's time to set the record straight on a lot of it and explain some of my attitudes and those of my family toward money. Up to a point, of course. After that, our finances, like those of any other normal-thinking American family, are nobody's business but our own. No question about it. A lot of my feelings about money stem from growing up during the Great Depression. This heartland area we come from out here, Oklahoma, where I was born in 1918, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, it was all hard hit. My dad, Thomas Gibson Walton, was an awfully hard worker who got up early, worked long hours, and was completely, totally honest. He was also a bit of a character who loved to trade, loved to make a deal for just about anything: horses, mules, cattle, houses, farms, cars. Once he traded our farm in Kingfisher, Oklahoma for another one near Omega, Oklahoma. Another time, I remember, he traded his wristwatch for a hog so we'd have meat on the table. And he was the best negotiator I ever ran into. He had that unusual instinct to know how far he could go with someone, and he did it in such a way that he and the other guy always parted friends. Dad never had the ambition or confidence to build much of a business on his own, and he didn't believe in taking on debt. At various times, he was a banker, a farmer, a farm loan appraiser, and an agent for insurance and real estate. He never made much money, so the rest of us contributed what we could. My mother, Nan Walton, who I'll talk about more as I try to sort out where I got such powerful ambition, had the idea to start a little milk business. I'd get up early in the morning and milk the cows. Mother would prepare and bottle the milk, and I'd deliver it after football practice in the afternoons. I was selling magazines probably as young as 7 or 8 years old, and I had newspaper routes from the 7th grade all the way through college. I also raised and sold rabbits and pigeons. As a result of my experience of the Depression, I started out in the world with a strongly ingrained respect for the value of a dollar, and with another legacy from my parents, a real reluctance to spend it. Not that my knowledge of money and finance was all that sophisticated, in spite of a business degree from the University of Missouri. Another important influence was my wife Helen's family over in Claremore, Oklahoma, And just listening to her father, L.S. Robson, was an education in itself. He influenced me a great deal. He was a great salesman, one of the most persuasive individuals I have ever met, and I am sure that his knowledge of finance and the law, his success as a trader and a businessman, his whole philosophy were very important in shaping me. Helen's father organized his ranch and family businesses as a partnership, and Helen and her brothers were all partners. They took turns doing the ranch books and things like that. Helen herself has a bachelor's degree in finance, which back then was really unusual for a woman. Anyway, Mr. Robson advised us to do the same thing with our family, and we did, all the way back in 1951. What little we had at the time we put into a partnership with our kids, which was later incorporated into Walton Enterprises. Helen and I own 20% together, and each of the kids owns 20%. Over the years, Walton Enterprises is where all the Walmart stock has gone, and we still own about 38% of the company's stock today, which is really unusual for an outfit our size. It's also the best protection there is against takeover raiders. So along comes Forbes and says I'm the richest man in America, and there's no question that if you multiply the Walmart stock price by how much we own, then we are worth 25 or 30 billion or whatever they say. Of course, I have never seen that money myself. For one thing, I only own half of 20%. For another, as long as I have anything to do with it, and I'm confident this attitude will last at least another generation, most of that Walmart stock is staying right where it is, in stock. We don't need to buy a yacht. We don't need a fleet of limos. Besides, purchases like that wreck a company. If a family like ours sells off stock for high living and then, boom, somebody takes them over, everything goes down the drain. In fact, one of the real reasons I'm telling our story now is for the benefit of my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I want them to know this. If you start any of that foolishness, I'll come back and haunt you, so don't even think about it. I'm not trying to poor-mouth here. We certainly have more than adequate funds in this family, but money has never meant that much to me, not even as a means of keeping score. If we had groceries and a nice place to live, plenty of room to keep and feed my bird dogs, a place to hunt, a place to play tennis, and the means to get the kids good educations, that was rich. And we have had those things. We're not crazy. We don't live like paupers the way some people depict us. I just don't believe in a big, showy lifestyle, least of all here in Bentonville, where folks work hard for their money, and we all know we all put on our trousers just one leg at a time. We've certainly got more as a family than anybody should ever think about spending on themselves, and that's why when I'm gone, I plan to leave my personal estate to charity. Some of it to the Sam and Helen R. Walton Foundation, and some to the Family Support Foundation, both primarily devoted to supporting education. We've created academic chairs at various universities for the study of business, and we support various church and community groups. I'm also interested in doing anything I can to promote our free enterprise system. Now, when it comes to Walmart, there's no two ways about it. I am cheap. I think it's a real comment that Walmart never bought a jet airplane until after we had gone over $40 billion in sales and opened our first stores in Maine and California. But even then, they had to practically tie me up and hold me down to do it. On the road, we have traditionally slept 2 to a room, and we stay in Holiday Inns and Ramada Inns and Days Inns, and we eat a lot at family restaurants when we have time to eat. Why, with Walmart now a $50 billion plus company, do we stay so cheap? There's a simple answer. We still believe in the value of the dollar. We exist to provide value to our customers, which means that in addition to providing quality and service, we have a responsibility to save them money. Every time Walmart spends $1 foolishly, it comes out of our customers' pockets. Every time we save $1, it puts us one more step ahead of the competition, and that's where we always plan to be. People often ask me how I wound up in retailing, and usually I say it just sort of happened. But looking back now, I see the simple truth that I was tired and I wanted a real job. In June of 1940, I was about to graduate from the University of Missouri with a business degree, and my plan had been to continue on to the Walton School of Finance in Pennsylvania. I wanted to study insurance and then sell it. As college wound down, though, I realized how tired I was, tired of going to school in particular. And I also realized that even if I kept up the work routine I had through college, I still wouldn't have the money to go to Walton. In college, I had been working probably as hard as I ever worked in my life. I was a pretty good student and a fraternity man, and just generally one of those big man-on-campus types involved in all kinds of extracurricular activities. Ever since high school, I had made all my own money and bought all my own clothes, and that continued in college, except because Dad and Mother didn't have any money to spare. I had to add tuition and food and fraternity dues and date money to my expenses. I had thrown a newspaper route all through high school, so in college I added a few more routes, hired helpers, and turned it into a pretty good business. In addition, I waited tables, and I was also the head lifeguard in charge of the swimming pool. Instead of going to Walton, I decided to cash in what chips I already had, and I visited with 2 recruiters. Both of them made me job offers. I accepted the one from J.C. Penney. The deal was to report immediately to the J.C. Penney store in Des Moines, Iowa, and begin work as a management trainee. Salary $75 a month. That's when I went into retail, and except for a little time out as an Army officer, that's where I've stayed for the last 53 years, loving every minute. I was fortunate to go to work for a very motivational guy, a man named Duncan Majors, who trained more penny managers than anybody else in the country. His secret was to work us from 6:30 in the morning until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and on Sundays, when we weren't working, he would get us out to his house and we would play ping pong or cards, but we would also talk about retailing. I remember one Sunday, Duncan Majors had just gotten his annual bonus check from Penny's and was waving it around all over the place. It was for $65,000, which impressed the heck out of us boys. Majors was the guy who really got me excited about retail. He was so good. And then, of course, the icing on the cake was when James Cash Penney himself visited the store one day. He didn't get around to his stores as often as I do mine, but he got around nevertheless. I still remember him showing me how to wrap up merchandise with very little twine and very little paper, but still make it look nice. I worked for Penny's about 18 months, but early in 1942 the war was on, and as an ROTC graduate, I was gung-ho to go overseas. Because of a minor heart irregularity, though, I was classified for only limited duty. This kind of got me down in the dumps, and since I was just waiting around to be called up anyway, I quit my Penny's job and wandered south toward Tulsa with some vague idea of seeing what the oil business was like. Instead, I got a job at a big DuPont gunpowder plant in the town of Pryor, Oklahoma. The only room I could find was in nearby Claremore, and that's where I met Helen Robson one April night in a bowling alley. Pretty soon, we were engaged to be married, and I was off to the service. When I got out in 1945, I knew I wanted to go into business for myself, and as it turned out, an old friend of mine, Tom Bates, had a similar idea. I caught up with Tom working at Butler Brothers in St. Louis. Butler Brothers was a regional retailer with 2 franchise operations, Federated Stores, a chain of small department stores, and Ben Franklin, a chain of variety stores, what we used to call 5 and dimes or dime stores. Tom had a great idea. He and I would throw in together and buy a Federated department store on Delmar Avenue in St. Louis. We would each put up $20,000 and be partners. Helen and I had just gotten married, and we had $5,000 or so.
We could have borrowed the rest from her father, who was always very supportive. But that's when Helen laid down the law. First, no partnerships. They were too risky. Her family had seen some partnerships go sour, so she was dead set on the principle of working for yourself. Second, any town with a population over 10,000 was off limits. If you know anything at all about the initial small-town strategy that got Walmart going a couple of decades later, you can see that this preference of Helen's pretty much set the course for us. I went back to Butler Brothers to see what else they might have for me, and what they had was a Ben Franklin variety store in Newport, Arkansas, a cotton and railroad town of about 7,000 people in the Mississippi River Delta country. I remember riding down there on the train, still wearing my Army uniform, and giving this store the once-over, and then buying it for $25,000, $5,000 of our own money, and $20,000 borrowed from Helen's father. My naivete about contracts and such would later come back to haunt me in a big way, but at the time, I was sure that the store and the town alike had great potential, and since I've always believed in goals, I set myself one. Within 5 years, I wanted my little Newport store to be the best, most profitable variety store in Arkansas. It wasn't until after we closed the deal that I found out what a dog the store was. It had sales of about $72,000 a year, but its rent was 5% of sales, which, it turned out, was the highest rent anybody had ever heard of in the variety store business. No one paid 5% of sales for rent. And I had a strong competitor, a Sterling store across the street, which was doing double mine in sales. When we opened for business on September 1st, 1945, we were a typical old variety store, 50 feet wide, 100 feet deep. Back then, those stores had cash registers and clerk aisles behind each counter throughout the store, and the clerks would wait on the customers. I began coming up with promotional programs of my own, and then I started buying merchandise directly from manufacturers. I would say, "You're selling ribbons and bows to Butler Brothers, and then I have to pay Butler a big markup over your price. In the future, I want to buy direct from you." Most of the time, the manufacturers didn't want to make Butler Brothers mad, so they turned me down. Every now and then, though, I would find one who would do it my way. That was the start of a lot of the practices and philosophies that still prevail at Walmart today. I was always looking for offbeat suppliers or sources. I started driving over to Tennessee to some places that would give me merchandise at prices way below what Ben Franklin was charging me. I'd stuff the car and an old homemade trailer I had with whatever I could get good deals on, ladies' panties and nylons, men's shirts, and I'd bring them back, price them low, and just blow the stuff out the store. It drove the Ben Franklin folks crazy. Not only were they not getting their percentages, they just couldn't compete with the prices I was buying at. I started branching out. Somehow or another, I got in touch with a manufacturer's rep out of New York named Harry Weiner. Harry would go to all these different manufacturers and then list what they had for sale. When somebody like me sent him an order, he would take maybe 5% for himself and then send the order on to the factory, which would ship it to us. That 5% seemed like a pretty reasonable cut to me compared to 20% for Butler Brothers. I'll never forget one of Harry's deals, one of the best items I ever had, and an early lesson in pricing that got me thinking in the direction of what eventually became the Walmart philosophy of discounting. If you're at all interested in how Walmart did it, this is one story you've got to pay close attention to. Okay, Harry was selling lady satin panties with an elastic waist for $2 a dozen. We'd been buying similar panties from Ben Franklin for $2.50 a dozen, and selling them at 3 pair for $1. Well, at Harry's price of $2, we could put them out at 4 for $1 and make a great promotion. I ordered a bunch. We sold a bunch. The simple lesson we learned, which others were learning at the same time and which eventually changed American retailing, is the essence of discounting. By cutting your price, you can boost your sales to a point where you earn more at the cheaper price than at the higher price. In retailer language, you can lower your markup but earn more because of the increased volume. Things began to clip along pretty good in Newport in a very short time. We put a popcorn machine out on the sidewalk, and the popcorn sold like crazy. I thought about it, and finally I decided that we needed a soft ice cream machine out there, too. I screwed my courage up, and for the first time went and borrowed money from a bank. What at the time seemed like the astronomical sum of $1,800. The ice cream machine went out onto the sidewalk next to the popcorn machine. It was new and different. It attracted a lot of attention, and we really turned a profit on it. I paid off the $1,800 note in 2 or 3 years, the way I'd already paid off Helen's father, and I felt great about it. As good as business was, I never was a guy to leave well enough alone. I think my constant fiddling with the status quo may have been one of my biggest contributions to the later success of Walmart, which so many other people with their ideas and efforts also participated in. As I mentioned, our biggest competitor, a Sterling store, was across the street, and next door to Sterling was a Kroger grocery store. When I heard a rumor that Sterling was going to buy Kroger's lease and expand, I hustled over to see the lady who owned the building and convinced her to sell me the lease. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do with it, but I sure knew I didn't want Sterling to have it. Well, I decided to put in a small department store. Now, Newport already had several department stores, but we didn't think anything about it, and we opened ours up and called it Eagle Store. Not that I can remember why. I drew up a plan, bought fixtures and a sign and merchandise, and now we had 2 stores on the same street in the little bitty town of Newport, Arkansas. If merchandise didn't sell in one store, I'd try it in the other one. I hired my first assistant manager, and thankfully my brother Bud had come home from the war, and he joined up with us too. It would have been hard to feel better about our situation. Helen and I both have the kinds of personalities that make us want to get real involved in community life. We had joined the Presbyterian Church, and even though I was a Methodist, it worked out well. Helen was very active in church work and still is today, and also in PEO, an international women's organization. Our 4 children had come along by now, and I was active in the Rotary Club, and I'd become president of the Chamber of Commerce. I was pretty much involved in everything around town. By the time the 5 years I'd given myself to reach the goal were up, I'd met it. That little Ben Franklin store was the #1 Ben Franklin store for sales or profit, not only in Arkansas, but in the whole 6-state region. It was the highest volume variety store in Arkansas, and I don't believe there was a bigger one in any one of the neighboring states. Not every crazy thing we tried had worked out as well as the ice cream machine, of course, but we hadn't made any mistakes we couldn't correct quickly, except, it turned out, for one little legal error from right at the beginning. In all my excitement at becoming Sam Walton merchant, I had neglected to include a clause in my lease which gave me an option to renew after the first 5 years, and our success, it turned out, had attracted a lot of attention. My landlord, who was himself a department store owner, was so impressed with our Ben Franklin's success that he decided not to renew our lease at any price. He did, though, pay me a fair price for the franchise, fixtures, and inventory, and he gave the store to his son. With nowhere else in town to move our store, I had no alternative but to sell. I sold the Eagle store to Sterling. It was the low point of my business life. I felt sick to my stomach. I had built the best variety store in the whole region and worked hard in the community, and now, in effect, I was being kicked out of town. Because I have never been one to dwell on reverses, though, I decided I would simply pick myself up and get on with it, do it all over again, only even better this time. Somehow, over the years, folks have gotten the impression that Walmart was something I dreamed up out of the blue as a middle-aged man, and that it was an overnight success. It's true that I was already 44 when we opened the first Walmart in 1962, but the store was totally an outgrowth of everything we'd been doing since Newport. Like most other overnight successes, it was about 20 years in the making. I came out of that Newport experience with my pride a little damaged, but I'd made more than $50,000 on the sale of the Ben Franklin, and in looking back on it now, the whole thing was probably a blessing. At age 32, I was a full-fledged merchant. To make a fresh start, all I needed was a store. Helen and the kids and I started driving around in the spring of 1950 and looking in earnest for one. Bentonville was the smallest of the towns we considered, and it already had 3 variety stores when one was really all it needed. Still, I love competition, and Old Harrison's Variety was willing to sell. We doubled its size by acquiring a 99-year lease on the barber shop next door. No more 5-year leases for me. We tore the wall out. We put in brand new fluorescent lights. Basically, we built a new store, and for Bentonville, population 3,000, it was a big one. By this time, of course, I had started reading everything I could get my hands on about retailing, and one article I read was about 2 Minnesota Ben Franklin stores that had gone to self-service, a brand new concept at the time. I rode the bus all night to 2 little towns up there, Pipestone and Worthington. They had shelves on the sides and merchandise displays all the way back. No clerks with cash registers around the store, just checkout registers up front. Our Bentonville Ben Franklin was the 3rd self-service variety store in the whole country, and the first in our 8-state area. It was a big deal, even if no one here in Arkansas knew it was. Our first newspaper ad, still on display at our visitor center, promised free balloons for the kids, a dozen clothespins for 9 cents, iced tea glasses for 10 cents apiece. Folks turned out. The store took off. Now, I don't really know if the Newport experience had anything to do with it or not, but right away I started looking around for store opportunities in other towns. Maybe it was just my itch to do more business, and maybe, too, I didn't want all my eggs in one basket again. I know, though, that by 1952 I had driven down to Fayetteville and found an old Kroger store. When we took it over, we just called it Walton's 5 and Dime. It wasn't a Ben Franklin. Our main competitor was Woolworth, which had a great store on the same square, and there was a Scott store as well. Here we were challenging Woolworth and Scott with a little old 18-foot independent variety store. And I remember sitting on the square right after I bought it, listening to a couple of the local codgers say, "Well, we'll give that guy 60 days, maybe 90. He won't be there long." But this store was ahead of its time, too. Self-service all the way, which the competition wasn't. Really, this was the beginning of the way we would be operating for a long time to come, innovatively, expensively. Of course, I needed somebody to run that store, so I did something I would do for the rest of my run in the retail business without any shame or embarrassment whatsoever. I nosed around for talent in other people's stores. I got Willard Walker, my first real hire, out of a TG&Y dime store he was managing in Tulsa. The lure was a percentage of the profits. I remember those early days now mostly as a time of always looking around for ideas and items that would make our stores stand out. Sometime in there, the hula hoop fad hit, but the genuine articles were pricey and hard to get anyway. They were mostly going into the big city stores. A friend put me in touch with a manufacturer who sold us plastic hose, and with that we made our own hula hoops, and we sold a ton of them. While I was running around between Bentonville and Fayetteville and my Tennessee suppliers and the Ben Franklin regional office in Kansas City, my brother Bud borrowed some money and bought a Ben Franklin on his own up in the little bitty town of Versailles, Missouri. Bud and I weren't really doing any business together, but we kept in touch.
Well, one time I was up in Kansas City, and I heard about this big subdivision going up there with a 100,000 square foot shopping center in it. A whole new concept at that time. It was going to have an A&P store and a Ben Franklin store in the middle, a Crown Drug store at the end, and small shops in between. I called Bud and told him to meet me up there right away. I said, "You want to gamble and go into this thing?" And he said, "Might as well." And we did. We borrowed all the money we could and went into that Ben Franklin up there 50-50. If I ever had any doubts about the potential of the business we were in, that shopping center store ended them. The thing took off like a house afire. The first year we made about $30,000 profits on sales of $250,000, and that went up to $350,000 in no time. By now, though, with all the places I had to visit, I was driving too much to have time for anything else. I began to wonder if maybe flying wouldn't be smarter. Bud Walton remembers. One day I got a call from Sam, and he said, "Meet me in Kansas City. I want to buy an airplane." Boy, it took me by surprise. I always thought Sam was the world's worst automobile driver, and I thought, he'll kill himself. I did everything to try and talk him out of it, but he bought a plane anyway for $1,850. It had a washing machine motor, and it would putt-putt, then miss a lick, then putt-putt again. That was the start of the Walmart aviation era. I loved that little two-seater plane because it would go 100 miles an hour if you didn't have the wind against you, and I could get to places in a straight line. Now that I could move around easily, I just caught store fever. We quickly opened variety stores in Little Rock, Springdale, and Siloam Spring, Arkansas, and we had a couple more in Neodesha and Coffeyville, Kansas. All these stores were organized as separate partnerships between Bud and me, along with other partners, including my dad, Helen's two brothers, and even the kids who invested their paper route money. John Walton, Sam and Helen's second son, says, "This is hard to believe, but between my paper route money and the money I made in the Army, both of which I invested in those stores, it's worth about $40 million today." Whatever money we made in one store, we'd put it in another and just keep on going. And starting with Willard Walker, we would bring the managers we hired in as limited partners. If you had, say, a $50,000 investment in a store and the manager put in $1,000, he'd own 2.5%. That whole period, which gets very little attention from most people studying us, was really very, very successful. In 15 years' time, we became the largest independent variety store operator in the U.S. The only problem was the volume per store was so little we didn't clear much. This is why I began looking around for ideas that would break us over into something with a real payoff. Our first important clue came in the little town of St. Robert, Missouri, where we learned that by building larger stores, which we called family centers, we could do unheard of amounts of business for variety stores, $2 million and more in sales per store. After St. Robert, we made the formula work in Berryville, Arkansas, and right here in Bentonville, too. I began to hear talk of the early discounters, companies like Zayre and Arlen's and Two Guys up in the Northeast. And I remembered that lesson I'd learned a long time ago in Newport with the panties selling at 4 times the volume when we changed the price from 3 for $1 to 4 for $1. I started running all over the country studying the discounting concept, and then Herb Gibson, a barber from over in nearby Berryville, started a chain with the simple philosophy: buy it low, stack it high, and sell it cheap. Herb sold it lower than anybody had ever seen it sell before, and he sold more of it. He did it in Abilene, in Amarillo, and he did it around Dallas. But it wasn't until he moved onto the square in Fayetteville and started competing with our variety stores that I felt the stimulus to act.
The discounting idea was right. I knew it, but I was used to franchising, and I had the mindset. Generally, my experience with Ben Franklin had been positive, despite my outside buying, and I didn't want to have to build a company with all that support apparatus myself. With Herb Gibson on my heels, I went up to Butler Brothers headquarters in Chicago. I was armed with my usual yellow legal pad full of notes, and I made a big pitch for them to back me in discounting. I wanted them to be our wholesale arm, our merchandiser. It wouldn't have been all that difficult to put together an organization with them, but they weren't interested, and the only real option left was to open our own discount store. We did it in Rogers, Arkansas, which is just down the road from Bentonville, but bigger. In Rogers, there already was a Ben Franklin franchise, so we couldn't use Ben Franklin at all. Instead, I had made arrangements with a distributor in Springfield, Missouri. But basically, nobody wanted to gamble on that first Walmart. I think Bud put in 3%, and Don Whitaker, whom I had hired to manage the store from a TG&Y store out in Abilene, Texas, put in 2%, and I put in 95%. Helen signed all the notes along with me, and we pledged houses and property, everything we had. But in those days, we were always borrowed to the hilt. We were about to go into the discount business for real. Now, to tell the truth, that first Walmart in Rogers really wasn't all that great. We had a sign that said, "We sell for less," and satisfaction guaranteed. And these are two principles that still guide the company. We did $1 million the first year, a lot more than our variety stores, which did $200,000 to $300,000 a year. But remember, the St. Robert Family Center was doing $2 million. Once we opened Rogers, we just sat there and held our breath. Then we put similar stores up in Springdale and Harrison. But here I have to let David Glass tell his now famous story about coming to Harrison to see what a Walmart was and being so horrified at the sight. David Glass, CEO Walmart Stores, recalls, "In those days, word was starting to get out that a guy named Sam Walton had some interesting retailing ideas, so I drove down from Springfield, where I was with Crank Drugs at the time, to see a Walmart opening. It was the worst retail store I had ever seen. Sam had brought a couple of trucks of watermelons in and stacked them on the sidewalk. He had a donkey ride out in the parking lot. It was about 115 degrees, and the watermelons began to pop, and the donkey began to do what donkeys do, and it all mixed together and ran all over the parking lot. And when you went inside the store, the mess just continued, having been tracked in all over the floor. Sam was a nice fellow, but I wrote him off. It was just terrible."
Sterling had a great downtown store in Harrison, a huge variety store with tile on the floor, nice lights, really good fixtures, and good presentation. Ours was just barely put together, highly promotional, highly ugly, but with merchandise selling for 20% less. What we were trying to find out was this: would customers in a town of 6,000 population come to our kind of a barn and buy strictly because of price? They did. Walmart was off to a good start, and we saw lots of potential. But now Herb Gibson and other folks, too, were beginning to look at the smaller towns and say, "Hey, maybe there is something out there that we ought to look into." We figured we'd better roll the stores out fast. People are always asking me, what was the key to our success? It's a hard question, really, and there are lots of answers. Practical business things like think small and have fun, swim upstream and shop the competition. But as for magic keys or secrets, I don't have any. Really, I'm pretty much like most businessmen I know in most ways, except for this almost uncontrollable drive I've always had to excel, and which has given me an unusually competitive nature.
If I had to single out one element in my life that has made a difference for me, and by extension helped Walmart stand out from the crowd, it would be my passion to compete. I have always pursued everything I was interested in with a true passion, some would say obsession, to win, and I've always held the bar pretty high for myself. So when I bought that first store in Newport, I wasn't going to sit there and be just an average, ordinary Ben Franklin owner. I felt there wasn't any reason we couldn't develop the best variety store in the state of Arkansas. I felt I had the talent to do it, that it could be done, so why not go for it? Even when I was a kid, I was ambitious. I was a class officer several years. I played football and baseball and basketball. I swam. I was so competitive that starting out in Boy Scouts, I made a bet with the other guys about which one of us would be the first to reach the rank of Eagle. I won. I got my Eagle at age 13, the youngest Eagle Scout in the history of the state of Missouri at that time. I wasn't what you call a gifted student, but I always worked really hard and made the honor roll. I was president of a student body, I was quarterback for an undefeated state champion football team, and I was voted most likely to succeed. By college, the pattern of my life was pretty well set. When I threw myself into something, I went all the way. And though most folks think Walmart has occupied most of my competitive energy over the years, it's not completely true. I've had my other passions, too, like bird hunting and tennis. I've pursued them both pretty competitively, too. I don't know what causes a person to be ambitious, but in my case, a lot of it could have come from my mother, who was an extremely ambitious person, in an unselfish sort of way. My mother read a lot and loved education, even though she didn't have too much herself. And she always encouraged me to do quality work and to develop my leadership abilities. And she sat with me and helped me with my schoolwork and my projects. She must have been a pretty special motivator, because I really took her seriously when she told me I should always try to be the best I could at whatever I took on. I have to say there's one aspect of my boyhood which it pains me to bring up, but Helen thinks it was an important influence on my life, so I'll mention it briefly. The simple truth is that Mother and Dad were two of the most quarrelsome people who ever lived together. I loved them both dearly, and they were two fine and wonderful individuals, but with each other they were always at odds. I'm not exactly sure how this situation affected my personality, unless it was partly a motivation to stay so busy all the time, but I swore early on that I would never involve my family in squabbling. Now, when I met Helen 50 years ago at that Claremore bowling alley and started courting her, I just fell right in love with her. She was pretty and smart and educated, ambitious and opinionated and strong-willed, with ideas and plans of her own. Also, like me, she was an athlete who loved the outdoors, and she had lots of energy for getting involved in things. In addition to all her own fine qualities, Helen came from a wonderful family with a real sense of togetherness. I've already told you how much the Robsons influenced Helen and me in the organization of our finances, but really, I think that successful, happy family was just in every way an inspirational model for me as a young man, and of course, it was the only kind of family Helen ever considered having. We made deliberate plans. We said we wanted 4 kids, and Helen said she wanted to have them all by the time she was 30, so she could enjoy her grown children and her grandkids. Sure enough, while we were still in Newport, we had 4 kids, 3 boys, Rob, John, and Jim, and a girl, Alice. In the early years before Walmart, I don't think our family was much different from most other families of that era, except that everybody was involved in working around the store. Helen bore more than her share of raising the kids, and I worked long hours, at least 6 days a week. A principal reason Helen insisted on our living in a small town, I'm sure, was so we could raise the kids with the same values she and I had learned in our youth, and we did raise them that way. Through our combined efforts, the kids did receive a heartland upbringing based on the bedrock values of hard work, honesty, neighborliness, and thrift. And it took. I think they've handled everything really well. Despite everything they've had to deal with because of me and their financial situation, they've grown up into a fine bunch of adults. Rob was our first company lawyer, and he did most of the work to take us public. As vice chairman, he's still real involved with the company today, but mostly in the real estate area, in board matters, and in looking after the family's interest. Jim learned a lot about real estate and the art of negotiation from his Uncle Bud, who I believe is almost as good a negotiator as our dad was. After Bud sort of stepped back from his involvement with locating and buying store sites, Jim took over. He was really good at it, and they still tell stories about him flying into some small town, unfolding his bicycle, and pedaling around looking for a site. He never told anybody who he was, and he got some great deals. Now he's running Walton Enterprises, and I think he's almost as tight with the dollar as I am. Alice has her own investment company down in Fayetteville now, and in some ways I believe she's the most like me, a maverick, but even more volatile than I am. John, who was a Green Beret medic in Vietnam, became our second company pilot. I was the first. He's the most independent of the bunch and the only one who doesn't live here in Arkansas, and he's just a tremendous individual. He and his family live out west where he designs and builds sailboats, and he also owns a large crop dusting business. We're all pilots, so it's real easy for us to get together on a moment's notice. John Walton recalls, I remember asking Dad for permission to climb a bluff overlooking the Buffalo River. He said, do anything you're big enough to do. What an exhilarating confidence booster for a 12-year-old. Later, when I was a young man trying to find my way in the world, he gave me an open invitation to join the Walmart team, but never a hint of pressure. What a wonderful way to grow up. Now, not long ago, somebody showed me an article that was written about our little company in 1960. It was called Success Story of the Year. It appeared in a local magazine, and it talked about how we had built up an empire of 9 variety stores. Then it quoted me as saying we probably wouldn't grow much more because I believed in personally supervising the stores. Well, Sam, you've got every right to ask, what the heck happened? How did you ever get to be the largest retailer in the world with a philosophy like that? The truth is, I really believed what I said then. I still do. It's just that we figured out a way to grow and stay profitable, and for me to maintain up-close personal supervision. Right up until very recently, when I just got too sick, I spent much of my time flying around and looking at our stores. I believe in controls, in knowing just what is going on in the stores at all times. But from the very beginning, even on my paper routes in college, I have also been a delegator. I always hired the best possible people as managers, and I tried to keep them at it by letting them buy stock and share in profits. Walmart still believes in all of that. It's hard to think of another company that sustained the kind of growth we did over 30 years without any major financial problems or dips in profitability. During those years, our business was growing at annual rates of anywhere from 30% to 70%. Along the way, we always had folks waiting for us to stumble and fall, especially Wall Street types. They said we'd never be able to keep doing things our way after we reached $1 billion in sales. But we did. We kept right on going. And then they said everything would fall apart at $10 billion because you just couldn't manage a company that big with our little down-home management philosophies. We roared past that and then hit $20 billion and $30 billion, and this year we'll probably hit around $53 billion. 2 years ago, we earned $1 billion in profits for the first time. That's a jump from only $41 million just 10 years before. If those are hard numbers to get a handle on, here are some other ways to think about Walmart's size. Last year, we sold enough men's and women's underwear and socks to put a pair on every person in America with some to spare. We sold 1/4 of all the fishing lines sold in the U.S., some 600,000 miles of it, or enough to go around the earth 24 times. We sold 55 million sweatsuits and 27 million pairs of jeans, and we sold almost 20% of all the telephones sold in the U.S. I could go on and on like this, but you get the idea. We're big, really big. Now, that's not something I like to focus on. I always wanted to be the best retailer in the world, not necessarily the biggest. In fact, as I suggested in that article 30-something years ago, I've always been a little bit afraid that big might get in the way of doing a good job. Here's the point I'm leading up to. The bigger Walmart gets, the more essential it is that we think small, because that's exactly how we have become a huge corporation, by not acting like one. To grow big, you have to think small. Above all, we are small-town merchants, and I can't tell you how important it is for us to remember when we puff up our chests about all those huge sales, that they were all made one day at a time, one store at a time, mostly by the hard work and good attitude and teamwork of the store managers and hourly associates, as well as by all the folks who work around the clock in the distribution centers. If we ever get carried away with how important we are because we're a great big $50 billion chain instead of one store in Blytheville, Arkansas, and another in Macomb, Mississippi, and another in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, then you probably can close the book on us. If we ever forget that looking a customer in the eye and asking politely if we can help is just as important today as it was in that little Ben Franklin in Newport, then we just ought to go into a different business, because we'll never survive in this one. For me, thinking small is a way of life, and I suspect thinking small is an approach that almost any business could profit from. The bigger you are, the more urgently you probably need to do it. At our size today, there's all sorts of pressure to regiment and standardize and operate as a centrally driven chain where everything is decided on high and passed down. Certainly all the vendors and suppliers would love to see us get that way. It would make their job simpler. In a system like that, though, there's no room for creativity, no place for the kind of maverick I was in the early days at Ben Franklin, no call for the entrepreneur or the promoter. For several decades now, we've really worked at building a company that's simple and streamlined and takes its direction from the grassroots. It's really a pretty tall order for an outfit with almost 400,000 associates spread out all over the country. But along the way, we've learned some practical ways to keep our thinking small, and I want to tell you about 6 of them. First, think one store at a time. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. We've got one store in Panama City, Florida, and another 5 miles away in Panama City Beach. But they're really worlds apart when it comes to their merchandise mix and their customer base. One is built for tourists going to the beach. The other is more like a normal Walmart for folks who live there in town. That's why we try our best to put a merchant, someone with a real flair for retail, in charge of each of those stores, and try and develop other merchants as department heads. For the merchandise mix to be right, it has to be managed by folks who actually deal face-to-face with customers. The alternative is that you end up with a bunch of unsold work boots and overalls in the Panama City Beach store, and at the Panama City store in town, you've got a bunch of unsold water guns and fishing rods and pails and shovels. In Bentonville, we've always had a big meeting on Saturday mornings. The meeting is a way of taking stock of ourselves, and we like to spend a lot of time at that meeting focusing on a single store somewhere, how that store is doing against a single competitor in a particular market. We talk about what that store is doing right
and we look at what it's doing wrong. Focusing on a single store can accomplish a number of things. First, of course, it enables us to actually improve that store. But if in the process we also happen to learn a particular way in which, say, that Panama City Beach Walmart is outsmarting the competition on beach towels, then we can fast get that information out to all our other beach stores around the country and see if the approach works everywhere. Which brings us to the next principle. Communicate, communicate, communicate. At Walmart, we communicate in many ways, from the simple phone call to the weekly Saturday morning meetings, to our elaborate satellite system, which we use for training and all sorts of special information sharing. The necessity for good communication in a company as big as ours is so vital you can't overstate it. Because what good is figuring out a better way to sell beach towels if you aren't going to communicate it to everybody who needs to know? If the folks in St. Augustine, Florida don't get the word on what's working over in Panama City, they miss an opportunity. And if our buyers in Bentonville don't know we're expecting to double our sales of beach towels in some given period, the stores won't have enough to sell. As Walmart exploded into the giant it is today, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on satellites and computers, both to keep track of details and to spread information around the company quickly. I'm really proud of the fact that we were way ahead of the current trend toward sharing information as a source of power. Ideally, we might actually want every department head in every individual store to spend time with the vendors who make the sales calls in Bentonville. But obviously, we're too big for that. So we try to think up ways to get at a similar result. Recently, for example, we've started seminars for our department managers. We'll pick a department like sporting goods or lawn and garden. Then we'll pick one department head from each of our 184 store districts and bring them all into Bentonville to talk to the buyers about what's working for them and what's not. After that, we have them meet with the vendors and tell them what kinds of complaints we're getting on their products or what's really working. Together, all these folks formulate a plan for the coming season, and the department heads go back to their districts and share what they've learned with their counterparts in other stores. As much as we travel to our stores and bring our folks into Bentonville, though, sometimes I just get the feeling that the word is not getting out. And if it's on a subject I feel strongly enough about, I get in front of one of our TV cameras here and go out by satellite to associates gathered in front of monitors in the break rooms throughout our system. A few Christmases ago, for example, I went on camera and visited with everybody a little about how our sales were. I talked about how my hunting was going. I hoped their holiday season was going well. And then I got to the point. I don't think any other retail company in the world could do what I'm going to propose to you, I said, but it's simple. It won't cost us anything, and I believe it would just work absolute magic on our customers, and our sales would escalate, and I think we'd just shoot past our Kmart friends in a year or two, and probably Sears as well. I want you to take a pledge with me. I want you to promise that whenever you come within 10 feet of a customer, you will look them in the eye, greet them, and ask them if you can help them. Now, I have no way of knowing how much effect my little pep talk or any little communication like that has, but this is a fact. We went on from that Christmas to pass both Kmart and Sears in sales at least 2 years before even the most optimistic Wall Street analysts thought we could do it. Now, here's the third principle. Keep your ear to the ground. As chairman of Walmart, I, of course, was the one who ultimately authorized all those expenditures for technology. But a computer is not, and never will be, a substitute for getting out in your stores and finding out what's going on. A computer can tell you down to the dime what you've sold. It can never tell you how much you could have sold. That's why we at Walmart are just absolute fanatics about our managers and buyers getting off their chairs here in Bentonville and getting out into those stores. We've got 18 airplanes, only one of them a jet, I'm proud to say, and our reason for staying in the air is to keep our ear to the ground.
Every Monday morning, our 18 regional managers, all of them based here in Bentonville, pile into those airplanes and head across the country to the stores in their regions. They stay out 3 to 4 days, usually coming back in on a Thursday. On Friday morning, we have a merchandise meeting, and the really valuable intelligence that surfaces in there is what everybody has brought back from the stores. If they're doing their jobs right, the regional managers know why things are or aren't selling, and what we ought to be thinking about selling next or dropping from our assortment. If they've been to that Panama City beach store and seen a suntan cream display that's blowing the stuff out the door, they can share that with the other regionals for their beach stores. Or if they've been to a big store in the Rio Grande Valley and found out they were getting beat by a competitor on ladies' dresses because their assortment is more suited to the taste of that area than ours, we can fix it. The fourth principle: push responsibility and authority down. The bigger we get as a company, the more important it becomes for us to shift responsibility and authority toward the front lines, toward that department manager who's stocking the shelves and talking to the customer. Probably our most famous technique for doing this is a program we call the store within a store. Instead of treating our department heads as just hourly employees punching a clock and then ripping open boxes and stacking whatever's in them onto shelves, which is the way it's done in a lot of big retail companies, we give our department heads the opportunity to become real merchants, managers of their own businesses, and in some cases, these departmental businesses are actually bigger in annual sales than a lot of our first Walmart stores were. It only works because we decided a long time ago to share so much information about the company with our associates, rather than keeping everything a secret from them. In the store within a store program, we share everything with our department heads: the costs of their goods, the freight costs, the profit margins. We let them see how their store ranks with every other store in the company on a constant running basis, and we give them incentives to want to win. Nothing makes me feel better than when I visit a store and some department head comes up to me with pride and shows me all her numbers and tells me she's number 5 in the company, but she plans to be number 1 next year. I love meeting all these merchants we've got on our team out there. When they show me a display loaded up with baby oil or lunch boxes and then tell me they chose that item because of its high profit margin, and they go on to brag about the volume they've done with that item, I get so proud for them I can hardly stand it. I really mean that. It's just the proudest I get. When I see this kind of thing going on out there, I know our size hasn't crippled us yet. We're always trying for that fine balance between autonomy and control. Our buyers, for example, have a lot more responsibility for deciding what's carried in our stores than buyers at most other companies. We run them hard and we give them a tough time because we don't want them getting the big head and thinking they're all powerful. But the fact is that our buyers, just like our folks in the stores, are in unique positions of authority for the retail business. Now, Principle 5, force ideas to bubble up. This one just goes hand in hand with pushing responsibility down, really, and we're always looking for new ways to encourage our associates out in the stores to push their ideas up through the system. We do a lot of this at our Saturday morning meetings. We'll have associates who've come up with something that's really worked well for their store come in and tell everybody in Bentonville about it. And for about 15 years now, we've been running our VPI, Volume Producing Item Contest, which I love to participate in myself. Basically, what it amounts to is that everybody from department manager level up chooses an item of merchandise they want to promote, with big displays or whatever, and then we see whose item produces the highest volume. I've always thought of the VPI contest not just as a way to stimulate sales, but as a way to teach our associates how to become better merchants, to show them what can be done by picking an item that's available and figuring out a creative way to sell it or buy it or both. It gives them the opportunity to act the way we used to in the early days. They can do crazy things like pick an item and hang it all over a tree filled with stuffed monkeys in the middle of the store, or drive a pickup truck into the aisle we call Action Alley in the back of the store and fill it with car washing sponges or whatever they think up that they can convince store managers to try. It's not just merchandising ideas we're looking for from our associates, though. When you consider that there are close on 400,000 of us, it's obvious that there are more than a few good ideas out there waiting to be seized. Our latest effort is a program called Yes We Can, Sam, which so far we figure has saved us about $8 million a year. Most of the ideas this program brings in are just common sense things that nobody picks up on when we're all thinking about how big we are. They're ideas that come from thinking small. One of my favorites came from an hourly associate who got to thinking about why we were shipping all the fixtures we bought for our warehouses by common carrier when we own the largest private fleet of trucks in America. She figured out a program to backhaul those things on our own trucks and saved over $500,000 right there. We brought her in, we recognized her good thinking, and we gave her a cash award. Now, the sixth principle: stay lean, fight bureaucracy. Anytime a company grows as fast as Walmart has, in the way it has, there are always going to be pockets of duplication built up and areas of our business which we probably no longer need or maybe never needed in the first place. Nobody really likes to think about this kind of thing because nobody wants to have their job or the jobs of people who work for them eliminated. But it is absolutely the responsibility of a company's top management to be thinking about this all the time to ensure a sound future for the company as a whole. One way I've approached this is simply by sticking to the formula I used back when we had about 5 stores. In those days, I tried to operate on a 2% general office expense structure. In other words, 2% of sales had to carry our buying office, our general office expense, my salary, Bud's salary, and when we started adding district managers and other officers, it had to pay their salaries too. Believe it or not, we haven't changed that basic formula in our growth from 5 stores to 2,000 stores. In fact, we have actually reduced our office overhead as a percentage of sales over the last 30 years, and that's despite tremendous expenses for computer support and distribution center support. Some folks in the retail business have asked me where I came up with the 2% formula, and the truth is, I just pulled it out of the air. In the early days, most companies took 5% of their sales to run their offices, but here's the thing. We have always operated lean. We have operated with fewer people than other companies have, and that by virtue of coming to work earlier and staying later. A lot of first-time visitors are kind of shocked by our offices, too. They say our offices look like something you'd find in a truck terminal. They're not real big, and the walls are covered with inexpensive paneling. But they're all we need, and they must be working fine. Ask our shareholders. A lot of bureaucracy is really the product of some empire builder's ego. Some folks have a tendency to build up big staffs around them just to emphasize their own importance, and that's one reason I feel so strongly about not letting egos get out of control around Walmart. If you're not serving the customer or supporting the folks who do, we don't need you. Well, once we opened our 3rd store in Springdale, I knew we were onto something that was going to work. But at the time, most folks, including my own brother Bud, were pretty skeptical about the whole idea. They thought Walmart was just another one of Sam Walton's brainstorms. It was totally unproven at the time, but it was the logical next step from what we'd been doing, experimenting, trying to do something different, educating ourselves as to what was going on in the retail industry, and trying to stay ahead of the trends. This is a big contradiction in my makeup, a paradox really, that I don't completely understand to this day. In many of my core values, things like church and family and civic leadership and even politics, I'm a pretty conservative guy. But for some reason, in business, I have always been driven to buck the system, to innovate, to take things beyond where they've been, to create a little anarchy. Mostly because of my own stubborn nature, I guess, Walmart from the very beginning has had to swim upstream. When I took my yellow legal pad up to those Ben Franklin folks in Chicago and gave the best darned argument you ever heard for why discounting would work in small towns, I was trying my darndest to get in the mainstream, to follow the flow of retailing toward discounting within the confines of an established organization. But when they told me it would never work because the small-town markets would never support it, there was nothing left to do but turn around and swim against the current. The truth is, I guess they made me a little mad when they told me my big idea wasn't so good, and that's where the stubbornness probably took hold. Don Soderquist, former president of Ben Franklin and now vice chairman and chief operating officer of Walmart, remembers. I first met Sam in 1964 when I was in charge of data processing at Ben Franklin, and he was our biggest franchiser. He had already opened the Rogers Walmart, and he was up in Chicago trying to convince our officers to franchise his discount stores in small towns. They gave him a flat no. After the meeting, he came back to see me and moved right on to the subject of computers. He wanted to know all about how we were using them and how we were planning to use them. And he took everything I said down on this yellow legal pad. Well, the next day was Saturday, and I went shopping at the Kmart near my house. I saw this guy talking to one of the clerks, and I thought, geez, that looks like that guy I met yesterday. What the heck is he doing way out here? I strolled up behind him, and I could hear him asking the clerk, well, how frequently do you order? How much do you order? And if you order on a Tuesday, when does the merchandise come in? He's writing everything she says down in a little blue spiral notebook. Then he gets down on his hands and knees, and he's looking under the stack table, and he opens the sliding doors and says, how do you know how much you've got under here when you're placing that order? Finally, I said, Sam Walton, is that you? And he looked up from the floor and said, oh, Don, hi. What are you doing here? I said, I'm shopping. What are you doing? And he said, oh, this is just part of the educational process, that's all. Of course, he's still doing the same thing today, except he uses his little tape recorder. I guess everybody who knew I was going ahead with the discounting idea on my own really did think I'd just completely lost my mind. I laugh now when I look back on Walmart's beginning. In 1962, the discount industry was fairly young and full of high-living, big-spending promoters driving around in Cadillacs, guys who had just had the world by the tail. But it had very few of what you'd call good operators, until 1962, the year which turned out to be the big one for discounting. In that year, 4 companies that I know of started discount chains. S.S. Kresge, a big 800-store variety chain, opened a discount store in Garden City, Michigan, and called it Kmart. F.W. Woolworth, the granddaddy of them all, started its Woolco chain. Dayton Hudson out of Minneapolis opened its first Target store. And some independent down in Arkansas opened something called a Walmart. At the time, and for quite a while after that, I can guarantee you that hardly anybody noticed that last guy. Heck, within 5 years, Kmart had 500 stores to our 19 and sales of almost $900 million to our $9 million. Here's what makes me laugh today. It would have been absolutely impossible to convince anybody back then that in 30 years, most all of the early discounters would be gone, that 3 of the 4 new chains would be the biggest and best operators in the business, that the one to fold up would be Woolco, and that the biggest, most profitable one would be the one down in Arkansas. It really is just so impossible to believe that sometimes even I have trouble believing it. I can tell you this, though. After a lifetime of swimming upstream, I am convinced that one of the real secrets to Walmart's phenomenal success has been precisely that talent of ours. Many of our best opportunities were created out of necessity, the things that we were forced to learn and do because we started out underfinanced and undercapitalized in these remote, small communities, contributed mightily to the way we've grown. Had we been capitalized, or had we been the offshoot of a large corporation the way I wanted to be, we might not ever have tried the Harrisons or the Springdales and all those other little towns we went into in the early days. It turned out that the first big lesson we learned was just that there was much more business out there in small-town America than anybody had ever dreamed of. We stuck with what we had learned in the variety store business about customer service and satisfaction guaranteed, but I have to admit that in those days we did not have anywhere near the emphasis on quality that we have today. What we were obsessed with was keeping our prices below everybody else's. Our dedication to that idea was total. We tried to build decent buildings, but we had to keep the rent down. We never liked to pay more than $1 a square foot. So, as I've already suggested, our stores really didn't look all that good either. Store number 8 in Morrilton, Arkansas, for example, was an old Coca-Cola bottling plant. We bought old fixtures and hung them by baling wire from the ceiling. We had clothes hanging in layers on conduit pipe and shelves wired to the walls. But this was really a small town, so number 8 was another experiment. We didn't have systems. We didn't have ordering programs. We didn't have a basic merchandise assortment. We certainly didn't have computers, but we sold our merchandise at the lowest prices possible, and that's what really kept us right side up for the first 10 years. That and consistently improving our sales in these smaller markets by building up our relationship with the customers. The idea was simple. When customers thought of Walmart, we wanted them to think of low prices and satisfaction guaranteed. They could be pretty sure they wouldn't find it cheaper anywhere else, and if they didn't like it, they could bring it back. Clarence Lease, the second manager of Walmart number 1 in Rogers, Arkansas, recalls, Rogers had been open about a year, and everything was just piled up on tables with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. Sam asked me to kind of group the stuff by category or department, and that's when we started that. The thing I remember most, though, was the way we priced goods. Sam wouldn't let us hedge on a price at all. Say the list price for some piece of merchandise was $1.98, but we had only paid 50 cents. Initially, I would say, well, it's originally $1.98, so why don't we sell it for $1.25? And Sam would say, no, we paid 50 cents for it, mark it up 30%, and that's it. No matter what you pay for it, if we get a great deal, pass it on to the customer. And, of course, that's what we did. It was a little wild there for a while, being out on our own with no basic merchandise assortment, no established distributors, no real replenishment system, no credit. Salesmen would show up at our door and we would try to get the best deals we could. But it was difficult to get some of the bigger companies, such as Procter & Gamble and Eastman Kodak, to call on us at all. And when they did, they would almost dictate to us how much they would sell us and at what price. I don't mind saying that we were the victims of a good bit of arrogance from a lot of the vendors in those days. The biggest challenge was buying health and beauty aids at low cost and staying stocked up on them, because those items were really at the heart of almost every early discounter strategy. I figured that out after I went into the first Gibson store. Herb Gibson's whole concept was to buy direct at a lower cost than individual stores could buy, then charge $300 a month to run one of his franchises, and he would act as the store's buying agent. The basic discounter's idea was to attract customers into the store by pricing these items, toothpaste, mouthwash, headache remedies, soap, shampoo, right down at cost. Those were what the early discounters called your image items. That's what you pushed in your newspaper advertising, like the 27-cent crest at Springdale, and you stacked it high in the stores to call attention to what a great deal it was.
Word would get around that you had really low prices. Everything else in the store was priced low too, but it had a 30% markup. Health and beauty aids were priced to give away. Charlie Cate, an early Walmart store manager, recalls, "From day one, Mr. Walton made it clear that Walmart wasn't just Ben Franklin with low prices on some items. He wanted real discounting. He said, 'We want to discount everything we carry.' When the other chains around us weren't discounting, he said, 'We advertise that we sell for less and we mean it.' So whatever else we did, we always had to sell for less. If an item came in and everybody else in town was selling it for 25 cents, we'd go with 21 cents. As far as building the company up, at that time we simply weren't doing it. I had moved my office from the Ben Franklin on the Bentonville Square to an old garage nearby, and I worked in there with 3 ladies who helped out with the bookkeeping. By then, we had 18 Ben Franklins and a handful of Walmarts, and we kept a little pigeonhole on the wall for the paperwork from each store. Once a month, we'd enter all the figures and come up with a profit and loss sheet for each store. I would send that P&L immediately to the store manager, and if there was a problem, I would meet with the manager. I had a big ledger sheet with probably 15 columns on it for sales, expenses, net profit, markdowns, taxes, even for utilities and postage. That was what I carried in my pocket when I went to the stores, so everybody always knew exactly where they stood. I did it myself each month with a pen. The closest thing we had to an operations manager then was Don Whitaker, the guy I hired to be our first Walmart store manager. Don became our first regional manager. He had barely finished high school, if that, and he had terrible grammar. He had one eye, he would look at you here, and his glass eye would shoot somewhere else. But Don was one of the finest people I have ever known in my life. He was a hard-working, practical, smart guy, and when he wanted something done, it got done. I single him out here because Don Whitaker was very, very important in the early development of the company, establishing the philosophy of let's be out front, let's do it right, let's get it done now, and get on with it. Claude Harris, an early Walmart manager and one of the company's first buyers, says, "Sam is very sharp at reading people, and he didn't make any mistakes hiring people back then, if I do say so myself. Really, back early on, with a store taking in only $8,000 to $12,000 a year net, it would have taken only 1 or 2 dishonest managers to sink the whole company. Sam would meet you in your store and invite you down to look at his stores. Then he and Helen would have you out to the house and serve ice cream, and they'd always ask if you and your family went to church. Sam, I think, wasn't just looking for store managers. He was selecting people he thought he could go forward with." We found Claude Harris running a Woolworth store over in Memphis and probably making $10,000, $12,000 a year. I hauled up in front of his soda fountain one day and started talking to him. I found out he had saved money on that salary of his, and I usually felt that if a fella could manage his personal business, he would probably be successful managing one of our stores. We placed Claude in our variety store on the east side of the square in Fayetteville so that he had to compete against our other store on the west side of the square. That was a real test because nobody was more competitive than Charlie Baum, who supervised that other store. Claude Harris recalls, "My store wasn't making much money, and we were starting to get competition from Gibson's, which also had a little store on the square down there. It was obvious that this discounting thing was working and that they were pulling everybody in with their health and beauty aids, HBA we call it. I thought, well, why don't I try that? I changed the whole store around and got McKesson Robbins down in price and put in a bunch of over-the-counter drugs. It was the first discount department in our company, the health and beauty aids department on the east side of the square there. But I nearly lost my best friend over that one. Charlie Baum nearly had a heart attack. He thought I was trying to undercut him.
You got to understand that Charlie is one of the most competitive people who ever lived. He'll fight you tooth and toenail at bridge or anything. I was just trying to see where it might lead us. Anyway, Sam knew all about it, and he said, go ahead and try it. He would always try things like that. He was always open to suggestions, and that's one reason he's been such a success. I guess the thing those early managers and I all had the most in common was that we loved merchandising. Don't get me wrong, our early merchandising wasn't all that good. We didn't necessarily have the best assortment of merchandise, and it wasn't necessarily displayed seductively. Remember, we didn't have any real distribution system yet, and we bought where we could. But we all loved to find unusual items, and the store managers had a lot of freedom to try different things. I suspect I, personally, have emphasized item merchandising and the importance of promoting individual items to a greater degree than any other retail management person in this country. It has been an absolute passion of mine. It's what I enjoy doing as much as anything in the business. What I love personally is to pick an item, maybe the most basic merchandise, and then dramatize it and sell huge quantities of it, when everybody knows that without promotion we would have sold very little. I think this obsession of mine with merchandising has set our company apart from the very beginning and really made us difficult to compete with. And man, in the early days of Walmart, it really got wild sometimes. Phil Green, a Walmart manager from early on, remembers, me and Sam used to have a big time picking items. We'd go buy a Dallas newspaper and a Little Rock newspaper and a Fort Smith newspaper, and he'd say, well, now, Phil, let's make us up some kind of an ad for this weekend. So we'd look around the store and find a big display of socks or a big display of panties or a wastebasket or a broom or a big old stack of motor oil. We'd pick out, say, 20 items, and then we'd sit down on the floor with a pair of scissors and go through those newspapers until we found some store that had run oil, and we'd just cut out the oil can and paste it on there and write Pennzoil 30W and stick our price on it. We'd do the same thing for the socks, the panties, the wastebasket, and it worked, because our prices were real hot. A little later on, Phil ran what became one of the most famous item promotions in our history. We set him down to open store 124 in Hot Springs, Arkansas, the first store we ever opened in a town that already had a Kmart. Phil got there and decided Kmart had been getting away with some pretty high prices in the absence of any competition. So he worked up a detergent promotion that turned into the world's largest display ever of Tide. He worked out a deal to get about $1 off a case if he would buy some absolutely ridiculous amount of it, something like 3,500 cases. Then he ran it as an ad promotion for something like $1.99 a box, off from the usual $3.97. When I saw how much Phil had bought, I really thought he'd completely gone over the dam. This was an unbelievable amount of soap. It made a pyramid of detergent boxes all the way to the ceiling, and it was 75 feet or 100 feet long, and took up the whole action alley in the back of the store so you could hardly get past it. Phil Green remembers, Mr. Sam usually let me do whatever I wanted on these promotions, but on this one he came down and said, why did you buy so much? You can't sell all of this. The thing was so big, though, that it made the news. Everybody came to look at it, and it was gone in a week. I had another one that scared them in Bentonville, too. I bought 200 Murray 8-horsepower riding mowers at $175 apiece. When they came in, we lined them up in front of the store, 25 in a row, 8 rows deep. We priced them at $199, which was less than half of what we'd sold them for previously, and we sold every one of them.
In the early days of Walmart, this period we've been talking about, I really believe our emphasis on item promotion helped us to make up for a lot of shortcomings. An unsophisticated buying program, a less-than-ideal merchandise assortment, and practically no back-office support. Another way we tried hard to make up for our lack of sophistication was to spend as much time as we could checking out the competition. Charlie Cate recalls, I remember him saying over and over again, go and check our competition. Check everyone who is our competition. And don't look for the bad, look for the good. If you get one good idea, that's one more than you went into somebody's store with. Next, try to incorporate it into our company. Early on, with our donkey rides and mountains of tide, we must have looked so much like mere promoters that people didn't realize we were also trying to become the very best operators we could. Now, there's no question I have the personality of a promoter. In fact, I have occasionally heard myself compared to P.T. Barnum because of the way I love to get out in front of a crowd and talk up an idea, a store, a product, whatever I happen to be focused on. But underneath that personality, I have always had the soul of an operator, somebody who wants to make things work well, then better, then the best they possibly can. When folks saw me walking around scribbling notes on my coffee-stained yellow legal pad or hauling cartons into the stores from my station wagon, maybe they didn't take me that seriously. Maybe they mistook us for fly-by-night types. You know, in the discount business today, but out selling cars or swampland tomorrow. I think that misunderstanding worked to our advantage for a long time and enabled Walmart to fly under everybody's radar until we were too far along to catch. Truth be told, discounting did attract mostly promoters in the beginning, people who had been in the distribution center business or in real estate, guys who weren't really even aspiring merchants, but who saw a huge opportunity and came jumping in with all 4 feet. They would take a carbon copy of some store in Connecticut or Boston, hire some buyers, hire some supervisors who were supposed to know something about the business, and start opening up stores. A lot of those early guys lived pretty high, too. They flew around in jets, they vacationed on yachts, and they could afford to in the late 50s and through the 60s because this discounting thing was working so well. Customers flocked to the stores, and these guys swam in cash. Most of them could still be around today if they'd just done some basic things to serve their customers. But they expanded fast without building the organizations and the supports that you need, like distribution centers. They didn't even get out into their stores to see what was going on. They didn't mind their store. They didn't always have folks in their stores with good attitudes. Then Kmart got its machine in gear and just began to do it better and better. I remember going into their stores. I'll bet I've been in more Kmarts than anybody, and I would really be green with envy. So many of their stores were so superior to ours back then that sometimes I felt like we really couldn't compete. Not that we stopped trying. Target came along and did a fine job, too, taking the whole idea a little more upscale. The competition was getting difficult, and that's when all those guys who were failing to meet their customers' needs and who didn't build strong organizations, all those promoters, started to fall apart and fall out. Actually, during this whole period, Walmart was too small for the big boys to notice, and few of the promoters were even in our area, so we weren't competitors. That helped me get access to a lot of information about how they were doing things. I probably visited more headquarters offices of more discounters than anybody else ever. I would just show up and say, "Hi, I'm Sam Walton from Bentonville, Arkansas. We've got a few stores out there, and I'd like to visit with Mr. So-and-so, whoever the head of the company was, about his business." As often as not, they'd let me in, and I'd ask lots of questions about pricing and distribution, whatever. I learned a lot that way, and I felt we were definitely headed in the right direction. Still, as we developed, we began to feel a little out of control. In the late 60s, we had about 5 or 6 Walmarts and 14 or 15 Ben Franklin stores, which is a pretty good-sized company to be running with 3 ladies and myself in the office, Don Whitaker,
and a manager in each store. I made up my mind that we had to get somebody with some real management experience, and that's when I began courting Ferald Arend, who was a district manager for the J.J. Newberry chain. Ferald Arend, Walmart's first vice president for operations and later the company's first president, remembers. In mid-1966, Walmart No. 5 was under construction in Conway, Arkansas, and Sam flew me down to see it. It was in a terrible neighborhood, with a cotton mill on one side and a stockyard on the other. I wasn't impressed, and I told Sam I wasn't interested in the job he was trying to get me to take. Later on, after that Conway Walmart opened up, though, Sam called me and told me what the sales were. I thought, my gosh, that store did as much in one day as some of our bigger stores took a month to do. Bringing Ferald Arend in was an important step in getting our company organized. Another important step was my enrolling in an IBM school for retailers up in Schenectady, New York, and meeting Abe Marks, who was president of the Discounters Trade Association. Abe showed me how he used computers to control merchandise in his stores. Abe Marks, the head of Hartsfield Zodi's, remembers. In the 1960s, very few companies controlled merchandise the way we did, and Sam spent a lot of time reviewing our operations. Sam has just been a master of taking the best out of everything and adapting it to his own needs. What we helped Sam with was really logistics. Sam knew he was already in what the trade calls an absentee ownership situation, or in other words, putting stores out where you as management aren't. In a situation like that, you've got to have timely information. How much merchandise is in the stores, what's selling, what's not, what is to be marked down and what replaced. All this helps you control what we call inventory turnover, the ratio of sales to inventory. That's key. The more you turn your inventory, the less capital is required. Anyway, Sam's a genius. He realized, even at the rudimentary level he was on in 1966, that he couldn't expand unless he had the ability to capture this information on paper and control his operations, wherever they might be. He became really the best utilizer of information to control absentee ownerships that there's ever been, which gave him the ability to open as many stores as he opens and run them as well as he runs them and to be as profitable as he makes them. I went up to that school in Schenectady because I wanted to find out about merchandise control, but I also went because, knowing I'd never be any whiz-bang computer guy myself, I was looking to hire a good, bright systems person. One such bright person I met and stayed in touch with was Ron Mayer, the young chief financial officer at Duckwall Stores, who came to work at Walmart as vice president for finance and distribution. Today, I consider Ron's years from 68 to 76 to have been our most important period of development. We had a good thing going before Ron got there, but Ron and some of the people he brought on board invented our first systems for staying in close touch with the stores and knowing what was going on in them. Ron also began to build a distribution system. He was the main force that moved us away from the old drop shipment method, where a store orders directly from the manufacturer and has the merchandise delivered directly by common carrier. Ron pushed us instead toward merchandise assembly, whereby we could order centrally for all the stores, then assemble the orders at our Bentonville distribution center. He also pushed us toward cross-docking, whereby pre-assembled orders for individual stores would come in one side of our warehouse and leave out the other. After Ron came on board, we were really well positioned for serious growth. We had a retail concept we believed in, the core of a professional management team, and the foundation of systems which would support growth. In 1969, we had 14 Ben Franklins and 18 Walmarts, and we were raring to see how much farther we could go. Bud and I, very quietly, began to think about taking the company public. I had never been really comfortable with debt. Not when I borrowed that $1,800 to buy the ice cream machine, not later. But I had gotten pretty good at accumulating it. For a while, I would just go down to the local bank and borrow whatever I could to build a store or buy something we needed to grow. That practice had gotten me in debt to practically every bank in Arkansas and southern Missouri. I always paid the loans off, but sometimes I would have to borrow from one bank to pay another, and the debt weighed heavy on me. With the help of two investment banking firms, White Weld in New York and Stevens Incorporated in Little Rock, Walmart became a public company, traded over the counter on October the 1st, 1970. The prospectus offered 300,000 shares at a price of $15, but it sold for $16.50. It was pretty well received, though not widely held. To start off, we had only about 800 shareholders. Walmart's stock performance and the wealth it has created for those early shareholders and for hundreds of thousands of others is, of course, a story in itself. As recently as 15 years ago, the market value of the company was around $135 million. Today, it's over $50 billion. Pure and simple, that's where the Walton family net worth has been created, since initially we kept half the stock ourselves. Personally, I've never spent much time worrying about stock prices, though. What I have worried about has been any failure to take care of our customers, any failure of our managers to motivate our associates, and the struggle to keep the team concept and the family concept meaningful. In fact, we have had some tremendous fluctuations in our stock price. Sometimes it'll be way up because retailing is fashionable with the investment community. Sometimes it will go down because somebody writes a report saying our strategy is wrong. For example, when we bought Kuhn's Big K stores, which took us east of the Mississippi for the first time in a significant way, several reports said we were taking on more than we could handle, and we would never make it once we got to Atlanta or New Orleans or wherever and met some real competition. Whenever the big institutional investors read something like that and believe it, they unload 1 million shares or 500,000 shares. As companies get larger with a broader following of investors, the temptation becomes awfully great to get into a plane and go up to Detroit or Chicago or New York and speak to the bankers and the people who own your stock. I feel our time is better spent with our own people. Not that we don't go out of our way to keep Wall Street up to date. For the last several years, a group called the United Shareholder Association has, in fact, voted us the #1 company in the U.S. for providing shareholder information. It's just that as business leaders, we absolutely cannot afford to get all caught up in trying to meet the goals that some big city analyst or financial institution sets for us on a 10-year plan spit out of a computer set to compound at such and such a rate. If we do that, we take our eye off the ball. What we have to do instead is demonstrate in our sales and our earnings every day, every week, that we're doing our job in a sound way. We have to follow the practices that made a first Boston analyst say simply, in one of my favorite reports ever, Walmart is the finest managed company we have ever followed. We think it is quite likely the finest managed company in America, and we know of at least one investor who thinks it is the finest managed company in the world. We do not expect to find another Walmart in our lifetime. Once we had gone public and had money to expand with, we were really able to do something with our key strategy of putting good-sized discount stores into those little towns that everybody else was ignoring. In those days, the early 70s, Kmart wasn't going into towns with a population below 50,000, and even Gibson's wouldn't go into towns much smaller than 10,000 or 12,000. We knew our formula was working even in towns smaller than 5,000 people, and there were plenty of such towns out there. When people want to simplify the Walmart story, that's usually what they single out. Oh, they went into small towns when nobody else would. That supposedly was the secret of our success, and a lot of folks have written us off as country hicks who stumbled onto the idea by accident. Well, maybe it was an accident, but our strategy wouldn't have worked if we hadn't figured out a way to implement it. The plan we came up with called for saturating a market area by spreading out, then filling in. It was a rule that each of our stores had to be within a day's drive of a distribution center or warehouse. So what we would do is put in a distribution center, then go out as far as we could from it and put in a store. Then we would backfill. We saturated northwest Arkansas that way. We saturated Oklahoma. We saturated Missouri. Sometimes we would jump over an area, like when we opened store number 23 in Ruston, Louisiana, and we didn't have a thing in South Arkansas, which is between us and Ruston. Then we started backfilling South Arkansas. We didn't go into cities, but we built stores in rings around them, often pretty far out, and waited for the growth to come to us. That strategy worked for us around Tulsa, around Kansas City, and around Dallas. The saturation strategy had all sorts of benefits beyond control and distribution. For example, when you move from town to town the way we did in these mostly rural areas, word of mouth gets your message out to customers pretty quickly, so we never had to spend much money on advertising. When we had 75 stores in Arkansas, 75 in Missouri, 80 in Oklahoma, whatever, people knew who we were, and except the merchants who weren't discounting, people looked forward to our coming to their towns. For the most part, we repeated what worked and stamped stores out cookie-cutter style. The only decision we had to make was which of our 5 different standard-sized stores to put in any given market. But I had traveled so much looking at competitors in the variety store business that I had a pretty good feel for a community's potential. We hardly ever passed up any market because it was too small. We still more or less follow the spread and fill saturation strategy today. Today, I admit, we've moved into some cities outright. But our basic idea is still to get out in front of the growth and let population build around us. Same as in the beginning, we start around the cities, customers drive past our stores, they get to know us, and the amazing thing to me is how quickly it works. There's no question that we could not have done it all if I hadn't had my airplanes. Once we started really rolling the stores out, the airplane turned into a great tool for scouting real estate. We were probably 10 years ahead of most other retailers in scouting locations from the air, and we got a lot of great ones that way. From up in the air, we could check out traffic flows, see which ways cities and towns were growing, and even evaluate the competition, if there was any. I loved doing this myself, of course. I'd get down low, turn my plane up on its side, and fly right over a town. When we had our spot picked, we'd land, find out who owned it, and try to negotiate the deal right then. We had what we call a store opening plan, but basically what we would do is just call in all the assistant managers we had and have them go at it. We assembled fixtures, ordered merchandise, and planned advertising, not to mention hiring and training folks to run the stores. I remember how, for one opening, I didn't want to spend any money on motels, so we all camped out in sleeping bags on the floor of one of our guys' houses. His furniture hadn't even gotten there yet. Farrell Arend made a big difference in that early rollout of Walmart's because he was a very organized person in a way that I really wasn't. He was the kind of a guy who, if he had 10 things to do in a day, he would write them all down and then work to get them done. He would double back to see that people did what he told them to do. I never did that as a rule in those days. I just kept moving. Watching the thing take off, managing that whole period of growth was really the most exciting time for me personally. There has never been anything quite like it in the history of retailing. It was the retail equivalent of a real gusher, as they say in Oklahoma and Texas. The whole thing just sort of blowed. We were bringing great folks on board to help make it happen, but at that time I was also involved in every phase of the business myself. Merchandising, real estate, construction, studying the competition, arranging the financing, everything. We were all working untold hours, but we were putting up 50 new stores a year, while most other discounters were trying to put up 4 or 5 or 6. People would say, "How do you do it? There's no way you can be doing that." But we were doing it. We just stayed on top of it, and we increased our profitability right along with our sales. from 30 million in sales and 1 million in profitability in 1970 to 1.2 billion in sales and 41 million in profitability in 1980. On paper, really, we had no right to do what we did. We were stretching our people and our talents to the limit. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we didn't have growing pains. Farrell Aaron recalls, more than anything else, we had manpower problems, finding good people and getting them trained in a hurry. When I had been at Newberry's, a guy had to have 10 years' experience before we'd even consider him to be what we called a manager in training. Down here, Sam would take someone with hardly any retail experience, and if he thought they showed potential, he'd make them an assistant manager. The assistant managers would go around and open all the new stores, and they would be next in line to manage their own stores. In my opinion, most of these people weren't anywhere near ready to run stores, but Sam showed me that if you take someone who has real willingness to work his tail off, 9 times out of 10 he'll make up for what he lacks in experience. It was one way we were able to grow so fast. With everything else that was going on in the early 70s, Farrell Aaron and Ron Mayer and a few other people and I were still trying to get a handle on how to distribute to all these stores in one-horse towns off the beaten path. It was one of those things that used to drive me crazy. I was always walking through the warehouse in Bentonville saying, where does this go? Who bought this? We've got too much of that. Meanwhile, the guys out in the stores would be crying for this stuff, and we couldn't get it out to them. I remember being very nervous when everybody decided we needed to buy our own trucks, but we did it. We had 2 tractors and 4 trailers, and the folks in the warehouse got to where they thought we needed 4 tractors and 6 trailers. I thought that was pretty extreme. Some days, word would get out that I was on my way out to the warehouse, and if they had an extra tractor or trailer sitting around not doing anything, they'd haul it to the other side of the building so I wouldn't see it. Thomas Jefferson, an early Walmart district manager and later operations manager hired from Sterling Stores, remembers, the faster we grew, the further behind we fell. Sometimes we would actually have 500 trailers full of merchandise sitting around one of the warehouses, and it took time to deal with all that. We couldn't get it out. Then the next day we'd get 60 boxcar loads. We'd have to unload the darn boxcars, and the merchandise they wanted in the stores would sometimes be sitting there a week or a week and a half. It was a big problem, and one that worried me a lot, which is probably why, as we moved along in the 70s, I just kept after guys like David Glass, who was still in the discount drug business up in Missouri, and Don Soderquist, who was running Ben Franklin, to come work for us. I knew they were both big talents, and I knew we were going to need all the help we could get, especially in areas I wasn't all that great at, such as distribution and systems. As I've already said, Ron Mayer had worked hard on that distribution system. He introduced merchandise assembly, cross-docking, and transshipment. Still, I don't think our distribution system got under complete control until David Glass finally came on board in 1976. More than anybody else, David's responsible for building the sophisticated and efficient system we use today. This may be jumping ahead of the story a little, but David had a vision for automated distribution centers, linked both to our stores and to our suppliers by computer, and he set about building such a system beginning in 1978 at Searcy, Arkansas. Now we have 20 of these centers placed strategically around the country. Combined, they account for more than 18 million square feet of distribution space, and almost 85% of our store replenishment passes through them, as opposed to only about 50 to 65% of our competition. We also rely on our private truck fleet much more than our competitors. At last count, we had more than 2,000 over-the-road tractors and more than 11,000 trailers, up considerably, obviously, from the days when the equipment had to be hidden from me. I'd like to try to describe the activity at one of our distribution centers for you. Start with a building of around 1.1 million square feet, which is about as much floor space as 23 football fields. Fill it high to the roof with every kind of merchandise you can imagine, from toothpaste to TVs, toilet paper to toys, bicycles to barbecue grills. Everything in it is bar-coded, and a computer tracks the location and movement of every case of merchandise while it's stored and when it's shipped out. Some 600 to 800 associates staff the place, which runs around the clock 24 hours a day. On one side of the building is a shipping dock with loading doors for around 30 trucks at a time, usually full. On the other side is the receiving dock, which may have as many as 135 doors for receiving merchandise. Things move in and out of the warehouse on some 8.5 miles of laser-guided conveyor belts, which means that the lasers read the barcodes on the cases and then direct them to whatever truck is filling the order placed by one of the stores it's servicing. On a heavy day, those belts might handle up to 200,000 cases of goods, and that's what's really hard to describe. The sight of all that merchandise moving in and out so fast under the direction of all those lasers. Again, ahead of the story a little, Jack Shoemaker, starting in the mid-'70s, pushed for heavy investment in better and better computer systems for tracking sales and merchandise and inventories, and especially for in-store systems that improved our ability to track transactions as they take place. Jack became our president and chief operating officer in 1978, and he worked really hard at getting me to invest in barcoding and SKU item control, which is a computerized stock-keeping inventory system. Jack was also heavily involved in the creation of our satellite system, which turned out to be another one of our tremendous competitive advantages. Jack Shoemaker recalls, "We had a data processing guy named Glenn Hayburn, and he and I had this dream of an interactive communication system between all the stores and the distribution centers and the general office. Glenn came up with the idea of using a satellite, and when we finally told Sam about it, he just listened. He wasn't discouraging, but he wasn't encouraging either. Sam never gets excited about systems. Eventually, we committed $24 million to this project, and now, of course, everybody has this sort of system. We've spent almost $700 million now on our computer and satellite system. I'm told it's the largest civilian database in the world, even bigger than AT&T's. Not that that matters to me much. What I like is the kind of information we can pull out of it on a moment's notice. For one thing, we keep a 65-week rolling history of every single item we stock, and that means I can pick, say, a little combination TV VCR and tell you exactly how many of them we've bought over the last year and a quarter and exactly how many of them we've sold. Not only overall, but in any or every region, every district, every store. We've always known, of course, that information means power, but the degree to which we can convert information to power through our computers is truly amazing. As I look back on the 1970s, the decade of our going public, one of the things that seems most astonishing to me is that our competitors didn't catch on quicker and try harder to stop us. Whenever we put a Walmart store into a town, we would just roll over the variety stores. It didn't take them long to figure out that if they were going to stay in business, they were going to have to go into discounting themselves, and most of them eventually did. Kuhn's Big K became a discount chain, and then in 1981 we finally bought it. Sterling launched its Magic Mart discount chain. Duckwall converted. So why didn't one of the bigger fish simply buy us? My guess is that if we had simply laid low, gradually putting together our company without stirring up the competition, that's what would have happened. Eventually, I think, we would have been forced to sell out to some national chain that saw us as a quick way to expand into the heartland market. Maybe there would have been 100 or 150 Walmarts out there for a while, but today they would all have Kmart or Target signs on them, and I would have become a full-time bird hunter. Anyway, we'll never know what would have happened because we decided that instead of avoiding our big competitors, we would meet them head-on, and it was one of the smartest strategic decisions we ever made. There's no doubt in my mind that we became the fine retailer we are today in large measure because of our big competitors. In fact, if our story doesn't prove anything else about the free market system, it proves beyond a doubt that spirited competition is good for everybody's business. There's no way we would be running anything nearly as good as our stores today if Kmart hadn't been around to make us do it, and I think they would admit that our presence has made them into a better retailer. One reason Sears has fallen so far is that it took them a long time to see that Walmart and Kmart were their real competition. At first, we just butted heads occasionally with other regionals like Gibson's and Sterling's Magic Mart, but in 1972 we decided, what the heck, and went right after Kmart itself in Hot Springs, Arkansas. At the time, it was the largest town we'd ever gone into, but we saw Kmart sitting there all alone, really just having their way with it. Their prices and their margins were so high in that non-competitive market, they almost weren't discounting at all. Hot Springs is the town where Phil Green stirred up all the fuss with his world's largest Tide display and all sorts of other outrageous promotions. Just to put things in perspective, both Kmart and Walmart had been out on the street for 10 years by this time, but Kmart was already relatively large and Walmart was still relatively small. So we are really talking about a case of the flea trying to attack the elephant. Kmart, though, had interested me ever since they put their first store out, and I had been itching to try our luck against them. Coincidentally, it was right around that time, 1973, I think, that Harry Cunningham chose to retire as CEO of Kmart, which he had founded while he was chairman of SS Kresge. It was probably a lucky coincidence for us because Harry was the guy who had made Kmart the model for all of us. At the time, I didn't know Harry, but I had a tremendous amount of respect for him as a merchant. Harry Cunningham says, "From the time anybody first noticed Sam, it was obvious that he had adopted almost all the original Kmart ideas. I always had great admiration for the way he implemented and later enlarged on those ideas. Much later on, when I was retired but still a Kmart board member, I tried to advise the company's management just what a serious threat I thought he was. But it wasn't until fairly recently that they took him seriously." The elephant didn't really respond right away, but I always believed it made them mad, us going in on them in Hot Springs. Maybe Harry's right. Maybe they didn't take us seriously at all. But just a few years later, we definitely got the message that Kmart thought Walmart had gotten too big for its britches. By that time, we had about 150 stores in 9 states, and they had over 1,000. They were making noises that the upstart was beginning to be a nuisance, and that they were going to do something to slow us down and make us back off. All of a sudden, they took a direct shot at us in 4 of our better towns, Jefferson City and Poplar Bluff in Missouri, and Fayetteville and Rogers in Arkansas. Our view of it was that they planned to land right on top of us and put us out of business. But it was probably the best single external event in Walmart's history. To us, it was like a war was on. We all got scared, and we all got excited. Thomas Jefferson, the Walmart director of operations in the late 70s, recalls, "Kmart really took us on about 1977, and I remember what happened in North Little Rock in particular. Kmart got real aggressive there, and we fought back. We told our manager there, no matter what, don't let them undersell you at all, on anything. I remember he called me one Saturday night and said, 'You know, we have Crest toothpaste down to 6 cents a tube now.' And I said, 'Well, just keep it there and see what they do.' They didn't lower it any more than that, and we both just kept it there at 6 cents. Finally, they backed off and started raising their prices back up to where they had been. I always thought they learned something about us then, that we don't bend easily, because they never came at us with that degree of price cutting anywhere else. Over the years, our friends at Kmart and a whole lot of other factors have made us so good, there's even developed a kind of Save the Small Town Merchants movement, as if the old-fashioned small-town merchants were precious endangered species like whales or whooping cranes, and we, Walmart, in competing for their business, are somehow the enemy of small-town America. Of all the notions I've heard about Walmart, none has ever baffled me more than this one, and nothing could be further from the truth. Walmart really has been the savior of a lot of the small towns. Walmart has actually saved quite a number of small towns from becoming practically extinct. We've saved the people who live in small towns literally billions of dollars, and we've created hundreds of thousands of jobs in small towns. Now, I don't have any trouble understanding why some merchant who's having a hard time competing with us wouldn't be too happy about our being there. That's easy to figure. What I haven't been able to figure at all is these other people who've decided we've somehow thrown the small town into decline. My guess is that a lot of these critics are folks who grew up in small towns and then deserted them for the big cities. Now they come home for a visit, and it makes them sad that the old town square isn't exactly like it was when they left it a couple of decades earlier. It's almost like they want their hometown to be stuck in time, an old-fashioned place filled with old-fashioned people doing business the old-fashioned way. Somehow, small-town populations weren't supposed to move out into their own suburbs, and they weren't supposed to go out to the intersections of highways and build malls with lots of free parking and a broad selection of merchandise, low prices, and evening business hours. Without Walmart, the change might have come along a little later, and in my opinion, it might not be as much a part of small-town culture as we are today. But what we're talking about here was absolutely a necessary and inevitable evolution in retailing, as inevitable as the replacement of the buggy by the car and the disappearance of the buggy whip makers. The small stores were just destined to disappear, at least in the numbers in which they once existed, because the whole thing is driven by the customers who are free to go wherever they choose to shop. Small-town merchants, by the way, aren't the only groups we've gotten into controversies with by sticking to our philosophy of putting the customer ahead of everything else. On the surface, the idea of serving the customer sounds so simple, so logical, and so obvious. But from the very beginning, the way we have practiced it has been so radical that it has frequently gotten us into trouble with what folks call the system. In the early days, the department stores put a lot of pressure on vendors to keep them from selling to discounters like us because they hated what we were doing, offering our customers prices much lower than theirs. Our vendors resented us for being so obsessed with prying the lowest prices out of them, and we've always had a problem with the idea of paying middlemen a big commission just because they're part of somebody's system. From the days when I was hauling that little trailer over into Tennessee to buy panties and shirts and avoid paying Butler Brothers markup, our philosophy on this has always been simple and crystal clear. We are the agents for our customers, and to truly be an agent for our customers and do the best job possible, we've got to operate as efficiently as we can, become the most efficient deliverer of merchandise through our distribution centers, through our purchasing methods, right on through the whole system. Sometimes that can best be accomplished by purchasing goods directly from the manufacturer, and other times we need to use middlemen to deal with smaller manufacturers and make the process more efficient. What we believe in strongly is our right to make that decision based on whatever it takes to best serve our customers. Claude Harris, one of Walmart's first buyers, says, "I always tell our other buyers, you're not negotiating for Walmart. You're negotiating for your customer. Your customer deserves the best price you can get. Don't ever feel sorry for a vendor. He knows what he can sell for, and we want his bottom price." And that's what we did and still do. We would tell the vendors, Don't leave in any room for a kickback, because we don't do that here. And we don't want your advertising program or your delivery program. Our truck will pick up at your warehouse. Now, what is your best price? And if they told me it was $1, I would say, fine, I'll consider it, but I'm going to go to your competitor, and if he says 90 cents, he's going to get the business. So make sure $1 is your best price. I've even threatened not to carry Procter & Gamble merchandise. They'd say, oh, you can't get by without carrying our merchandise. And I'd say, you watch me put it on a side counter, and I'll put Colgate on the end cap at a penny less, and you just watch me. Well, now we have a real good relationship with Procter & Gamble. It's a model that everybody talks about. But let me tell you, one reason for that is that they learned to respect us. They learned they couldn't bulldoze us like everybody else, and that when we said we were representing the customer, we were dead serious. In those days, of course, we desperately needed Procter & Gamble's product, whereas they could have gotten along just fine without us. Today, I'm told we are their largest customer, but it really wasn't until 1987 that we began to turn a basically adversary relationship into one that we like to think is the wave of the future, a win-win partnership between two big companies, both trying to serve the same customer. Believe it or not, as big as we had become by then, Walmart had never been called on by a corporate officer of P&G. Then one day, my close friend and longtime tennis buddy here in Bentonville, George Billingsley, called me up and asked me to join him on a canoe trip down the Spring River. He said he had this old friend, Lou Pritchett, who was a vice president with P&G, who wanted to meet me and talk about some things relating to our two companies. So I went along, and it turned out to be the most rewarding float trip I ever took. Lou Pritchett recalls, during that time on the river, we both decided that the entire relationship between vendor and retailer was at issue. Both focused on the end user, the customer, but each did it independently of the other. No sharing of information, no planning together, no systems coordination. We were simply two giant entities going our separate ways, oblivious to the excess costs created by this obsolete system. We were communicating, in effect, by slipping notes under the door. As a result, we assembled the top 10 officers of both companies in Bentonville for 2 days of soul-searching and thinking, and within 3 months, we had created a P&G Walmart team to build a whole new kind of vendor-retailer relationship. We formed a partnership to conduct our business, one of the most important outcomes of which was to start sharing information by computer. P&G could monitor Walmart's sales and inventory data and then use that information to make its own production and shipping plans with a great deal more efficiency. We broke new ground by using information technology to manage our business together instead of just to audit it. Competitive merchandising, distribution, and other technologies, market saturation, real estate strategy. The truth is that not one of these carried our company so far and so fast as the relationship, actually the partnership, that we have enjoyed with our associates. And by associates, I mean all those folks out in the stores and in the distribution centers and on trucks. I would love to tell you that this partnership was all part of my master plan from the beginning. You know, that as a young man, I had a vision of a great retailing company in which all the employees were awarded a stake, that I saw them participating in a lot of the decisions that would determine the profitability of the company. I would love to tell you that from the very beginning, we always treated our employees better than anyone else treated theirs, and paid them better than anyone else, and considered them our equals. I would love to tell you all that. Unfortunately, none of it would be true.
In the beginning, I was so chintzy, I didn't really pay my employees very well at all. The managers were fine. From the time we started branching out, we always had a partnership with the store managers. Guys like Willard Walker, Charlie Baum, they had a piece of their store's profits from the beginning. But we really didn't do much for the clerks except pay them an hourly wage, and I guess that wage was as little as we could get by with. It wasn't that I was intentionally cold or heartless. It's just that in my early days I was fighting to maintain a 6% profit margin, and in fairness to myself, low wages were pretty much standard in retail in those days, especially in the independent variety stores. The larger truth that I failed to see turned out to be another of those paradoxes, just like the discounter's principle of the less you charge, the more you'll earn. And here it is. The more you share profits with your associates, whether it's in salaries or incentives or bonuses or stock discounts, the more profit will accrue to the company. Why? Because the way management treats the associates is exactly the way the associates will then treat the customers. And if the associates treat the customers well, the customers will come back over and over and over, and that is where the real profit in this business lies, not in trying to drag strangers into your stores for one-time purchases based on splashy sales or expensive advertising. Satisfied, loyal, repeat customers are at the heart of Walmart's spectacular profit margins, and those customers are loyal to us because our associates treat them better than anybody else does. In the Walmart scheme of things, the most important contact ever made is between the associate in the store and the customer. Well, I didn't catch on to that idea for quite a while. In fact, the biggest single regret in my whole business career is that we didn't include our associates in the initial managers-only profit-sharing plan when we took the company public in 1970. But there was nobody around preaching that philosophy in those days, and I guess I was just too worried about my own debt and in too big a hurry to get somewhere fast. Today, some of our company's critics would like everybody to believe we started our profit-sharing program and other benefits merely as a way to stave off union organizing. The traditional version of what happened is that the Retail Clerks Union organized a strike against us when we opened the store in Clinton, Missouri, and another one when we opened the store in Mexico, Missouri, and that in response to those troubles, we started all these programs to keep the unions out. That story is partly true and partly not. We did have labor trouble in those two stores, and we did fight the unions, legally and above board, and we won. In fact, we've never lost a union organizing election, but the idea for sharing profits and benefits had come up even before we went public, not from me, but from Helen. Helen Walton recalls, "We were on a trip driving someplace, and we were talking about the high salary that Sam was earning and about all the money and benefits the officers were getting. He explained that the people in the stores didn't get any of those benefits, and I think it was the first time I realized how little the company was doing for them. I suggested to him that unless those people were on board, the top people might not last long either. I remember it because he didn't really appreciate my point of view at that time. Later on, I could tell he was thinking about it, and when he bought it, he really bought it." It may be true that our skirmishes with the various unions helped hurry along our thinking, but the truth is that once we started experimenting with this idea of treating our associates as partners, it didn't take long to realize the potential it had for improving our business. And it didn't take the associates long to figure out how much better off they would be as the company did better. I don't deny how I feel about unions. I have always believed strongly that we don't need unions at Walmart. Theoretically, I understand the argument that unions try to make, that the associates need someone to represent them, and so on. But historically, as unions have developed in this country, they have mostly just been divisive. They have put management on one side of the fence, employees on the other, and themselves in the middle as almost a separate business, one that depends on division between the other two camps. The problem is that a divisive situation like that breaks down direct communication and is not at all conducive to taking care of customers, to being competitive, to gaining market share, any of the things a good company aims for. The partnership we have at Walmart, which includes profit sharing, incentive bonuses, discount stock purchase plans, and a genuine effort to involve the associates in the business so we can all pull together, works better for both sides than any situation I know of involving unions. And I'm not saying we pay better than anybody, though we're certainly competitive in our industry and in the regions where we're operating. We have to be if we want to attract and keep good people. But over the long haul, our associates build value for themselves, financially and otherwise, by believing in the company and keeping it headed in the right direction. Let me say this, too. Anytime we have ever had real trouble or the serious possibility of a union coming into the company, it has been because management has failed to listen to our associates or because we have mistreated our associates. I think any time the employees at a company say they need a union, it's because management has done a lousy job of managing and working with their people. Usually it's directly traceable to what's going on at the line supervisor level, something stupid that some supervisor does or something good he or she doesn't do. That was our problem at Clifton and at Mexico. Our managers did some dumb things. They didn't listen. They weren't as open with their folks as they should have been. They didn't communicate with them. They didn't share with them. We fought those situations using pretty traditional methods. We hired a good labor lawyer, John Tate, who's won a lot of organizing battles over the years and who has since come with our company. His advice helped me to become even more determined to change the relationship between management and the associates at Walmart. Basically, it was the same thing I've been talking about. Take care of your people, treat them well, involve them, and you won't spend all your time and money hiring labor lawyers to fight the unions. John helped us launch a program called We Care, designed to let the associates know that when they had problems, we wanted them to come to us and give us a chance to solve them. Our message became, sure, we are a non-union company, but we are stronger because of it. And because you are our partners, we have an open door and we listen to you, and together we can work our problems out. We took our first and biggest step in relation to the associates in 1972, when we started a real profit-sharing plan. Every associate who has been with us at least a year and who works at least 1,000 hours a year is eligible. Profit sharing today has around $1.8 billion in it, equity in the company belonging to our associate partners. Let's face it, pretty much all aspects of Walmart culture are different. For starters, there aren't very many companies out there gathering several hundred of their executives, managers, and associates at 7:30 every Saturday morning to talk about business. Even fewer would begin such a meeting by having their chairman call the hogs. But that's one of my favorite ways to wake everybody up, by doing the University of Arkansas's Razorback cheer. You probably have to be there to appreciate the full effect, but it goes like this. Whoo, pig, suey! Whoo, pig, suey! Whoo, pig, suey! Razorbacks! Whenever I visit a store, I also try to find a moment to lead the associates in our own Walmart cheer. Give me a W, give me an A, give me an L, give me a squiggly. Here everybody sort of does the twist. Give me an M, give me an A, give me an R, give me a T. What's that spell? Walmart. What's that spell? Walmart. Who's number one? The customer. Now, I know most companies don't have cheers, and most board chairmen probably wouldn't admit to being good cheerleaders. But then most companies don't have a safety director like Mike Possum Johnson, who entertained us one Saturday morning by taking on challengers in a no-holds-barred persimmon seed spitting contest with one of our company lawyers as the target. Most companies don't have a gospel group called the Singing Truck Drivers, or a management singing group called Jimmy Walker and the Accountants. Here's the thing. Nobody in any business works harder than we do at Walmart. But because we work so hard, we like to have a good time. And we work better because we have a good time. We build spirit, and we build excitement. We break down barriers, which helps us to communicate better with one another. And we make our people feel part of a family in which none of us are too important or too puffed up to lead a cheer or be the butt of a joke or the target of persimmon seeds. Of course, we don't pretend to have invented the idea of a corporate culture, and we've been aware of a lot of the others that have come before us. In the early days of IBM, Tom Watson Sr., with his slogans and group activities, pioneered a lot of the stuff we do, and we've certainly borrowed every good idea we've come across. Helen and I picked up several ideas on a trip we took to Korea and Japan in 1975. A lot of the things they do over there are very easy to apply here. I guess the people outside our company began to realize just how different we folks at Walmart are back in 1984. That was the year I bet in a Saturday morning meeting that we couldn't possibly produce a pre-tax profit of more than 8%. I lost, and David Glass insisted I make good on my promise to put on a grass skirt and do the hula up on Wall Street. I thought the event was going to be sort of a family affair. I would slip in there and dance, and David would videotape for the Saturday morning meeting to prove that I really did it. Well, we got there, and it turned out David had hired a truckload of real hula dancers and ukulele players, and he or somebody had alerted the newspapers and TV networks to what we would be doing. We had all kinds of trouble with the police about permits, and the dancers' union wouldn't let them dance without heaters because it was so cold, and we finally had to get permission from the head of Merrill Lynch to dance on his steps. Eventually, though, I slipped on the grass skirt and the Hawaiian shirt and did what I think was a pretty fair hula. It was too good a picture to pass up, I guess, this crazy chairman of the board from Arkansas in this silly costume, and it ran everywhere. It was one of the few times one of these stunts really embarrassed me. But at Walmart, when we make a bet like I did, we always pay off. We know that our antics, our company cheers, or our songs, or my hula, can sometimes be pretty corny or hokey. We couldn't care less. Some of this culture just grew naturally out of our small-town beginnings. Our love of parades with marching bands, drill teams, and floats. Most of us grew up with that stuff, and we found that it can be even more fun when you're an adult and you spend most of your time working. In our early days, we tried to create literally a carnival atmosphere in our stores. We were only in small towns then, and often there wasn't a whole lot else to do for entertainment than going to the Walmart. We'd have these huge sidewalk sales, and we'd have bands and little circuses in our parking lots to get folks to those sales. We'd have plate drops, where we'd write the names of prizes on paper plates and sail them off the roofs of the stores. We'd have Moonlight Madness sales, which usually would begin after normal closing hours and maybe last through the evening, with some new bargain or promotion being announced every few minutes. We'd play shopping cart bingo, where each shopping cart has a number, and if your number is called, you get a discount on whatever you have in the cart. At store openings, we'd stand on the service counters and give away boxes of candy to the customers who had traveled the farthest to get there. As long as it was fun, we'd try it. Then there's the World Championship Moon Pie Eating Contest. This started back in 1985 when John Love, an assistant manager in Oneonta, Alabama, accidentally ordered 4 or 5 times more moon pies than he meant to and found himself up to his eyeballs in the things. Desperate, John came up with the idea of a moon pie eating championship as a way to move them out before they went bad on him. Who would have thought something like that would catch on? Now, though, the event is held every fall. It draws spectators from several states and has been written up in newspapers and covered by television literally all over the world. Corny? How could you get any cornier than that? But when folks do this sort of silly stuff, it's really impossible to measure just how good it is for their morale.
to know that you're supposed to have a good time, that there's no place for stuffed shirts, or at least that they always get their comeuppance, that's reassuring. Like the Arkansas Razorback cheer at our Saturday morning meetings. Without a little entertainment and a sense of the unpredictable, how in the world could we ever have gotten hundreds of people to get up every Saturday morning and actually come in with smiles on their faces? If they thought that all they could expect in that meeting was somebody droning on about numbers, could we have kept the meeting alive? No way. No matter how strongly I felt about the need for that meeting, the folks would have revolted. As it is, the Saturday morning meeting is at the very heart of the Walmart culture. Now, don't get me wrong. We don't get up early on Saturday morning just to have fun. That meeting is about business. Its purpose is to let everyone know what everyone else in the company is up to. If we can, we find heroes out there in the stores, and we bring them in and talk about them to the whole meeting. Everybody likes praise, and we look for every chance we can to heap it on somebody. But I don't like to go to the meeting and hear about just the good things that are happening. I like to hear what our weaknesses are, where we aren't doing as well as we should, and why. I like to see a problem come up and then hear suggestions from the floor as to how it can be corrected. If we decide we're doing something wrong and the solution is obvious, we can order changes right then and carry them out over the weekend while most everybody else in the retail business is off. The Saturday morning meeting is where we discuss and debate much of our philosophy and our management strategy. It is the focal point of all our communications efforts. It's where the wave is started that transmits the corporate culture out across the company in ripples. It's probably not the most exciting part of the meeting, but sometimes I like to read from management articles. We'll talk about competitors specifically, but also in general. For example, we'll spend 10 minutes maybe talking about how Walmart can compete successfully with all the good specialty retailers coming on the scene. The meeting is the forum in which we often first bring up goals that might appear unreasonable, or decide to try things that seem unattainable. That, in fact, is how I ended up dancing the hula on Wall Street. And, as embarrassing as it was to have to do that, believe me, a profit of more than 8% made it well worth the trouble. A strong corporate culture with its own unique personality, on top of the profit-sharing partnership we've created, gives us a pretty sharp competitive edge. But a culture like ours can create some problems, too. The main one, when folks like ours buy into a way of doing things, is resistance to change. And that's why I've made it my personal mission to ensure that change, even constant change, is actually a part of our culture. I've forced change, sometimes for change's sake alone, at every turn in our company's development, to the extent that one of the greatest strengths now is our ability to drop everything and turn on a dime. Let me give you an example. Obviously, if we were going to grow the way we have in areas such as technology, finance, marketing, legal, we had to bring in college-educated folks. But our old variety store managers didn't want me hiring those people. They had the idea that college graduates wouldn't get down and scrub floors and wash windows. The first ones we did hire, the culture tried to reject them. All this required some basic changes in the way we think about ourselves, about who's a good Walmart hire for tomorrow, and about what we can do for the folks already on board. That's one reason Helen and I started the Walton Institute down at the College of the Ozarks in Fort Smith. It's a place where our managers can go and get exposure to some of the educational opportunities they may not have had earlier on. Also, we as a company need to do whatever we can to encourage and help our associates earn their college degrees. It opens up their career opportunities, and it benefits us. I'll give you another example. Traditionally, we've had this attitude that if you wanted to be a manager at Walmart, you basically had to be willing to move at a moment's notice. You'd get a call saying you were going to open a new store 500 miles away, and you didn't ask questions. You just packed and went, and you worried about selling your house and moving your family later.
Maybe that was necessary back in the old days, I don't know, but I do know that it's not appropriate now. For one thing, as our company grows bigger, we need to find more ways to stay in touch with the communities where we operate. And one of the best ways to do that is by hiring locally and developing managers locally and letting them have careers at home, assuming they perform. For another, the old way really put women at a disadvantage in our company. In the old days, retailers felt the same way about women that they did about college boys, only maybe more so. They just didn't think women could handle anything but the clerk jobs because the managers usually did so much physical labor, like unloading trucks and hauling merchandise on two-wheelers. As the stores got bigger and the managers did less manual labor, old-timers began to say that women couldn't make good managers because their family obligations wouldn't allow them to move as often as we required. Well, nowadays we've got a number of women managing stores. Many of them are doing fine jobs, and we've got a lot more waiting in the wings. There's one period in Walmart history, specifically in the history of Walmart's upper management, that I have never been comfortable talking about. But everyone else has had a say on the subject, so I'm going to explain the events the way I saw them unfold and be done with it. As you'll see, it really turned out to be not such a big deal anyway, and now it's hardly anything but a historical blip. I am talking about a period in the middle 70s and starting in 1974, when I have to admit we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. By anybody's standards, we had built a heck of a discount chain. At that point, even Wall Street had bought into our strategy, and whatever reservations they had about me, they seemed to think pretty highly of Ron Mayer and the rest of the management team. The stock had split twice, and we were now listed on the New York Stock Exchange, with the result that at age 56, my net worth was far greater than I had ever imagined it could be. Our kids were out of college and starting up their own lives. I really didn't see how I could have reasonably expected much more out of life. I don't recall ever actually making the decision to stop and smell the roses, but I was beginning to back off a little from the business, play more tennis, and hunt quail for longer at a stretch. I was also increasingly leaning on Ron Mayer and Farrell Arend, who at that time were each responsible for running roughly half the company. It's hard to explain my situation very precisely because the truth is, from the beginning you would have had a heck of a time putting my job description down on paper or explaining my management style in terms they would understand at a business school. Somebody asked me once if I was a hands-on manager or an arm's-length type. I think really I'm more of a manager by walking and flying around, and in the process I stick my fingers into everything I can to see how it's coming along. If you ask me, am I an organized person, I would have to say flat out, no. And I don't have much of a routine either. I always carry my little tape recorder on trips to record ideas that come up in my conversations with the associates. I usually have my yellow legal pad with me, and I always have a list of 10 or 15 things I think we need to be working on as a company. But as you can guess, my style has always been to lay off a lot of the day-to-day operating responsibilities on other folks, to pick good people and give them maximum responsibility. Anyway, things were looking really good for Walmart around 1974, and I was beginning to step back a little. I'm not saying I ever really took my eye off the ball, but during that period I may well have had something in my eye and blinked. I was still chairman and CEO. Farrell Arend, who had been with us from the early days, was executive vice president for merchandising, and Ron Mayer, who was only 40 years old, was executive vice president for finance and distribution. As I look back on that period, I realize I had really set the company up to split into two operating halves, competing fiercely with one another. But in today's hindsight, what I was about to do next seems totally out of character for me, and it only compounded the problem tenfold. Farrell had made tremendous contributions to the company. He and I had worked together forever, but because of all the technology and sophisticated systems we were going to be needing, I really felt that Ron was the essential one. Ron had also made it pretty well known that his goal, which I respected, was to run a company, and he told me one day that if he couldn't run our company, he wanted to get out and run another one. I thought about that for a few days, and I really worried that we were going to lose Ron, and then I thought, well, I'm getting pretty old, and Ron and I could probably work together. I'll let him be chairman and CEO. I'll sit back a little and, of course, continue to visit stores. That's what we did. I became chairman of the executive committee. Ron became chairman and CEO of the company. Farrell became president. I moved out of my office down at the end of what they jokingly called executive row and let Ron have it. I moved into his office. I made up my mind to stay out of his way and let him run the company, telling myself that I would just check to see how he was getting along. Since I had really been letting other people run the company day to day anyway, I thought things would run real well this way. Well, I was no more ready to retire in 1974 at the age of 56 than the Arkansas sun is ready to start rising out of Oklahoma in the morning. I probably did take off a little more at that time, but I don't remember doing it very much, and I'm sure to Ron Mayer it must have seemed like I never took off at all. The truth is, I failed at retirement worse than at just about anything else I've ever tried. Actually, I knew it was a mistake almost right after I resigned the chairmanship. I tried to stay out of Ron's way. The problem was that I just kept doing exactly the same things I'd always done, and it must have been quite frustrating for Ron, as I think it would have been for any 40-year-old guy wanting to run his own company. Equally bad, the house was dividing against itself. A lot of the younger guys in finance and distribution were lining up on Ron's side, while the older bunch who ran the stores were turning to Farrell. I kept hoping things would work out, but the longer the atmosphere wasn't right, the more I intruded. I started giving Ron more direction, getting into areas that I really shouldn't have gotten into. I should say this. Walmart showed real good numbers during this whole period. It was never a question of mismanagement. What we had was a semi-retired founder who really didn't want to go away, an ambitious young manager with ideas of his own, and frankly, a pretty major clash of management styles. I've said before, publicly, that the whole thing was 90% my fault for even trying the venture. But it's also true that I didn't think Ron was handling some things very well. In particular, I worried about his people skills, and I felt like the whole clique thing was hurting management at the store end, our most unusual strength. I really did agonize over how I was going to straighten out this mess I had created. There have been very few times in my whole life when I've had things from work worry me enough to take them home with me, to lose sleep over them, so to speak, but this one did. I didn't want to disappoint Ron, I didn't want to lose him, but the company was headed in the wrong direction, and finally I called him in one Saturday, 20 months after I'd given up the chairman's job, and said simply, "Well, Ron, I thought I was ready to step out, but looking back on it, I see that really I wasn't. I've put you under a real handicap." I told Ron I wanted to come back in as chairman and CEO and have him assume another job, vice chairman and chief financial officer, I believe. My proposal wasn't agreeable to him, and I can certainly understand why. He wanted to run the company, and when he couldn't, he decided to leave us. After our talk, I put out a memo to the whole company announcing Ron's decision to leave. I took all the blame, saying it was all my fault for not holding up my end of the bargain. Then what they called the exodus began. A whole bunch of senior managers who had been part of Ron's team, our financial officer, our data processing manager, the guy who was running our distribution centers, all walked out behind him. You can imagine how Wall Street felt about that. A lot of folks wrote us off immediately. They thought again, as they have thought through the years, that we just didn't have the strength to hold things together. They assumed that Ron Mayer and his folks were the reason we'd done well, and they ignored the basics we had in place, the principles: keeping our costs down,
teaching our associates to take care of our customers, and frankly, just working our tails off. For the first time in a long time, things did not look so good. As I said, though, about losing that first lease in Newport, very few setbacks can't be turned into opportunities if you just dust yourself off and try. And as things turned out, this setback presented us with one of the great opportunities in our company's history. Ever since David Glass and I had met at that awful Walmart opening in Harrison, Arkansas, I had been trying to somehow get him to come work for us. He was a big deal at this discount drug chain up in Springfield, and I was just convinced he was one of the great retail talents I had met. For some time I had been after Ron Mayer to hire David, and he wouldn't do it. So when Ron left, David was the first person I went to see, and I finally talked him into coming to Walmart. I'm not saying that with David and Jack Shoemaker as executive vice presidents, David for finance and distribution, and Jack for operations and merchandise, we didn't still have some turf fighting between the two sides of the company. But man, we had as much retail talent and firepower together under one roof as any company could handle. Those two guys are completely different in personality, but they are both just whip smart, and with us up against it like we were, everybody had to head in the same direction. Once again, Walmart proved everybody wrong, and we just blew the doors off our previous performances. David came on and made tremendous contributions immediately. Ron Mayer may have been the architect of our original distribution systems, but David Glass, frankly, was much better than Ron had been at distribution, and that was one of the big areas of expertise I had been afraid of losing. David also was much better at fine-tuning and honing our accounting systems, and he, along with Jack, was a great advocate for much of the high technology that keeps us working and growing today. David made us a stronger company internally almost immediately. Not only did he turn out to be a great chief financial officer, he proved to be a great talent with people as well, all of which led to him eventually becoming a great CEO for us. It turned out that this new team was even more talented, more suited for the job at hand than the previous one that Wall Street put so much store in as they walked out the door. And incidentally, Helen showed some of the old Robson shrewdness for investment instinct in the midst of all this. When the stock got down so low, she took some of her own money and bought up a bunch for herself and our grandchildren. By now, it's probably clear to you that I've devoted most of my life to Walmart, starting it, growing it, refining the concept. I've had a really good life. It's been full and fun and challenging and rewarding beyond even my sometimes wild expectations. All that has begun to wind down for me, though. I'm really sick these days, and I guess when you get older and you're in the condition I'm in, you naturally turn just a little bit philosophical, especially late at night when you can't sleep, and your mind is turning everything over and over, trying to take stock of where you've been and what you've done. The truth is that if I hadn't gotten sick, I doubt I ever would have told this story, or taken the time to try and sort it all out. Temperamentally, I'm much too biased towards action to undertake such a sedentary project. But since I did, I'm going to go all the way and try to share with you how I feel about some things that seem important to me. This will sound really strange to people who know me well, but lately I've wondered if I should feel bad about having been so wholly committed to Walmart. Was it really worth all the time I spent away from my family? Should I have driven my partner so hard all these years? Am I leaving something behind that I can be really proud of, or does it lack meaning now that I face the ultimate challenge? Here's how I look at it. My life has been a trade-off. If I wanted to reach the goals I set for myself, which were always very high, I had to get at it and stay at it every day. I had to think about it all the time. But again, in the larger sense, the life and death sense, did I make the right choices? Well, I've thought about this a lot, and if I had the choices to make all over again, I've decided they would be just about the same. The thing is, I am absolutely convinced that the only way we can improve one another's quality of life while we're here on this earth, which is something very real to those of us who grew up in the Depression, is through what we call free enterprise, when it's practiced correctly and morally. And I really believe there haven't been many companies that have done that as well as we have at Walmart. It's not often that a company has done the things we've done in the way of improving the lives, the standard of living of our customers, for whom we've saved billions of dollars. The same goes for our associates with whom we've been able to share profits, and many of whom also have invested in our stock and ridden right along up with it over the years. Also, I think associates who believe in our ideals have gotten some real spiritual satisfaction, in the psychological, not the religious sense, out of their experience. They learn to stand up tall and look people in the eye and speak to them, and they feel better about themselves. And once they start gaining confidence, there's no reason why they can't just keep on improving themselves if they really want to. So I am just awfully proud of the whole deal, and I feel good about how I chose to expend my energies in this life. I know one thing for sure. We certainly changed retailing. I'll tell you this, those companies out there that aren't thinking about the customer and focusing on the customer's interests are just going to get lost in the shuffle if they haven't already. The greedy ones are just going to be left in the dust. Well, now it's time for me to forget about all that's past and think about what I want the legacy of Walmart to be. I'd like to believe that as Walmart continues to thrive and grow, it can really come to live up to what someone once called us, the lighthouse of the Ozarks. Only I hope we can spread the concept beyond our home region, because we're really a national company now. For Walmart to maintain its position in the hearts of our customers, we have to study more ways we can give back to the communities we're in. I'm tremendously proud of a lot of the things we've done. Scholarship programs and matching grants, the environment program, and the whole Buy American job creation incentive. But we're already studying ways we can go further to be involved, to give back to the communities which give us all our business. Really, to be more socially conscious all around. As just one example, our country desperately needs a revolution in education, and I hope Walmart can be involved at some level. Again, if for no other than selfish reasons. Without a strong educational system, the very free enterprise system that makes a Walmart or an IBM or a Procter & Gamble appear on the scene and strengthen our nation and its economy simply won't work. You may have trouble believing it, but every time we've tested the old saying, it has paid off for us in spades. The more you give, the more you get. Finally, a lot of folks ask me two related questions all the time. Could a Walmart-type story still occur in this day and age? And if I were a young man or woman starting out today with the same sorts of talents and energies and aspirations that I had 50 years ago, what would I do? The answer to the first one is, of course it could happen again. Somewhere out there right now there's somebody, probably hundreds of thousands of somebodies really, with plenty good enough ideas to take it all the way. The only question really is, does that somebody, do those many somebodies, want it badly enough to do what it takes to get there? The answer lies in attitude, in the capacity to constantly study and question. The second question is a little tougher. I don't know exactly what I would do today, but I feel pretty sure I would be selling something, and I expect at the retail level, where I could relate directly to customers off the street. I think I'd study the retail field today and go into the business that offered the most promise for the least amount of money. Probably some kind of specialty retail, something to do with computers maybe, something like the Gap, even the Body Shop. Anyway, I hope you'll remember some of this story the next time some overeager, slightly eccentric shopkeeper opens up a business in your neck of the woods. Before you write that newcomer off too quickly, remember those two old codgers who gave me 60 days to last in my dime store down in Fayetteville. Go check the new store out. See what they've got to offer. See how they treat you. And decide for yourself if you ever want to go back. Because this is what it's really all about. In this free country of ours, that shopkeeper's success is entirely up to you, the customer.
Those of you that have believed back in the 74s and the 73s and 78s have been well repaid for your confidence. It's been an interesting trip, an interesting ride, and I thank you very much for being here this week.
We hope you have enjoyed this Doubleday production of Sam Walton, Made in America, by Sam Walton with John Huey. This program was read by Kevin O'Morrison, produced by David Rapkin, and directed by Steve Gomer. Sam Walton, Made in America, is a production of Bantam Audio Publishing. Copyright 1992, all rights reserved.
Make him stop, David. Make him stop. That's good.